Section 28 of The Country of the Blind and Other Stories by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Peter Yearsley. The Truth About Pyecraft. He sits not a dozen yards away. If I glance over my shoulder I can see him, and if I catch his eye, and usually I catch his eye, it meets me with an expression. It is mainly an imploring look, and yet with suspicion in it. Confound his suspicion. If I wanted to tell on him, I should have told long ago. I don't tell, and I don't tell, and he ought to feel at his ease, as if anything so gross and fat as he could feel at ease. Who would believe me if I did tell? Poor old Pyecraft, great uneasy jelly of substance, the fattest clubman in London. He sits at one of the little club tables in the huge bay by the fire, stuffing. What is he stuffing? I glance judiciously, and catch him biting at a round of hot buttered tea cake, with his eyes on me. Confound him! With his eyes on me! That settles it, Pyecraft. Since you will be abject, since you will behave as though I was not a man of honour, here, right under your embedded eyes, I write the thing down, the plain truth about Pyecraft. The man I helped, the man I shielded, and who has requited me by making my club unendurable, absolutely unendurable, with his liquid appeal, with the perpetual don't tell of his looks. And besides, why does he keep on eternally eating? Well, here goes for the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Pyecraft. I made the acquaintance of Pyecraft in this very smoking room. I was a young, nervous, new member, and he saw it. I was sitting all alone, wishing I knew more of the members, and suddenly he came, a great rolling front of chins and abdomina, towards me, and grunted, and sat down in a chair close by me, and wheezed for a space, and scraped for a space with a match, and lit a cigar, and then addressed me. I forget what he said, something about the matches not lighting properly, and afterwards, as he talked, he kept stopping the waiters one by one as they went by, and telling them about the matches in that thin, fluty voice he has. But anyhow, it was in some such way we began our talking. He talked about various things, and came round to games, and thence to my figure and complexion. "You ought to be a good cricketer," he said. I suppose I am slender to what some people would call lean, and I suppose I am rather dark still. I'm not ashamed of having a Hindu great-grandmother, but for all that I don't want casual strangers to see through me at a glance to her, so that I was set against Pyecraft from the beginning. But he only talked about me in order to get to himself. "I expect," he said, "you take no more exercise than I do, and probably you eat no less." Like all excessively obese people, he fancied he ate nothing. Yet, and he smiled an oblique smile, we differ. And then he began to talk about his fatness and his fatness, all he did for his fatness, and all he was going to do for his fatness, what people had advised him to do for his fatness, and what he had heard of people doing for fatness similar to his. "A priori," he said, "one would think a question of nutrition could be answered by dietary, and a question of assimilation by drugs." It was stifling. It was dumpling talk. It made me feel swelled to hear him. One stands that sort of thing once in a way at a club, but a time came when I fancied I was standing too much. He took to me altogether too conspicuously. I could never go into the smoking room, but he would come wallowing towards me, and sometimes he came and gourmandised round and about me while I had my lunch. He seemed at times almost to be clinging to me. He was a bore, but not so fearful a bore as to be limited to me, and from the first there was something in his manner, almost as though he knew, almost as though he penetrated to the fact that I might, that there was a remote exceptional chance in me that no one else presented. "I'd give anything to get it down," he would say. "Anything." and peer at me over his vast cheeks and pant. Poor old Pyecraft. He has just gonged, no doubt to order another buttered tea cake. He came to the actual thing one day. Our pharmacopoeia, he said, our Western pharmacopoeia, is anything but the last word of medical science. In the East, I've been told. He stopped and stared at me. It was like being at an aquarium. I was quite suddenly angry with him. "Look here," I said, "who told you about my great-grandmother's recipes?" "Well," he fenced. "Every time we've met for a week," I said, "and we've met pretty often, you've given me a broad hint or so about that little secret of mine." "Well," he said, "now the cat's out of the bag, I'll admit. Yes, it is so. I had it from Pattison." "Indirectly," he said, which I believe was lying. "Yes." "Pattison," I said, "took that stuff at his own risk." He pursed his mouth and bowed. "My great-grandmother's recipes," I said, "are queer things to handle. My father was near making me promise." "He didn't?" "No, but he warned me. He himself used one once." "Ah, but do you think... Suppose there did happen to be one?" "The things are curious documents," I said. "Even the smell of 'em. No." But after going so far, Pyecraft was resolved I should go farther. I was always a little afraid if I tried his patience too much, he would fall on me suddenly and smother me. I own I was weak, but I was also annoyed with Pyecraft. I had got to that state of feeling for him that disposed me to say, "Well, take the risk." The little affair of Pattison, to which I have alluded, was a different matter altogether. What it was doesn't concern us now, but I knew, anyhow, that the particular recipe I used then was safe. The rest I didn't know so much about, and on the whole I was inclined to doubt their safety pretty completely. Yet, even if Pyecraft got poisoned... I must confess the poisoning of Pyecraft struck me as an immense undertaking. That evening I took that queer, odd-scented sandalwood box out of my safe and turned the rustling skins over. The gentleman who wrote the recipes for my great-grandmother evidently had a weakness for skins of a miscellaneous origin, and his handwriting was cramped to the last degree. Some of the things are quite unreadable to me, though my family, with its Indian Civil Service associations, has kept up a knowledge of Hindustani from generation to generation, and none are absolutely plain sailing. But I found the one that I knew was there soon enough, and sat on the floor by my safe for some time looking at it. "Look here," said I to Pyecraft next day, and snatched the slip away from his eager grasp. "So far as I can make it out, this is a recipe for loss of weight." "Ah," said Pyecraft, "I'm not absolutely sure, but I think it's that. And if you take my advice you'll leave it alone, because, you know, I blacken my blood in your interest, Pyecraft. My ancestors on that side were, so far as I can gather, a jolly queer lot. See?" "Let me try it," said Pyecraft. I leant back in my chair. My imagination made one mighty effort and fell flat within me. "What in heaven's name, Pyecraft," I asked, "do you think you'll look like when you get thin?" He was impervious to reason. I made him promise never to say a word to me about his disgusting fatness again, whatever happened. Never. And then I handed him that little piece of skin. "It's nasty stuff," I said. "No matter," he said, and took it. He goggled at it. But, he said. He had just discovered that it wasn't English. "To the best of my ability," I said, "I will do you a translation." I did my best. After that we didn't speak for a fortnight. Whenever he approached me I frowned and motioned him away, and he respected our compact. But at the end of the fortnight he was as fat as ever, and then he got a word in. "I must speak," he said. "It isn't fair. There's something wrong. It's done me no good. You're not doing your great-grandmother justice." "Where's the recipe?" He produced it gingerly from his pocket-book. I ran my eye over the items. "Was the egg addled?" I asked. "No. Ought it to have been?" "That," I said, "goes without saying in all my poor dear great-grandmother's recipes. When condition or quality is not specified, you must get the worst. She was drastic or nothing, and there's one or two possible alternatives to some of these other things. You got fresh rattlesnake venom? I got a rattlesnake from Jamrach's. It cost... That's your affair anyhow. This last item. I know a man who... Yes. Well, I'll write the alternatives down. So far as I know the language, the spelling of this recipe is particularly atrocious. By the by, dog here probably means pariah dog. For a month after that I saw Pyecraft constantly at the club, and as fat and anxious as ever. He kept our treaty, but at times he broke the spirit of it by shaking his head despondently. Then one day in the cloakroom he said, "Your great-grandmother." "Not a word against her," I said, and he held his peace. I could have fancied he had desisted, and I saw him one day talking to 3 new members about his fatness, as though he was in search of other recipes. And then, quite unexpectedly, his telegram came. "Mr. Formalin," bawled a page boy under my nose, and I took the telegram and opened it at once. "For heaven's sake, come! Pyecraft." Said I, and to tell the truth, I was so pleased at the rehabilitation of my great-grandmother's reputation this evidently promised, that I made a most excellent lunch. I got Pyecraft's address from the hall porter. Pyecraft inhabited the upper half of a house in Bloomsbury, and I went there so soon as I had done my coffee and Trappistine. I did not wait to finish my cigar. "Mr. Pyecraft," said I at the front door. They believed he was ill. He hadn't been out for 2 days. "He expects me," said I, and they sent me up. I rang the bell at the lattice door upon the landing. He shouldn't have tried it anyhow, I said to myself. A man who eats like a pig ought to look like a pig. An obviously worthy woman, with an anxious face and a carelessly placed cap, came and surveyed me through the lattice. I gave my name, and she let me in a dubious fashion. "Well," said I, as we stood together inside Pyecraft's piece of the landing. "He said you was to come in if you came," she said, and regarded me, making no motion to show me anywhere. And then confidentially, "He's locked in, sir." "Locked in?" "Locked himself in yesterday morning, and hasn't let anyone in since, sir. And ever and again swearing. Oh, my!" I stared at the door she indicated by her glances. "In there?" I said. "Yes, sir." "What's up?" She shook her head sadly. "He keeps on calling for victuals, sir. Heavy victuals he wants. I get him what I can. Pork he's had, suet pudding, sausages, new bread, everything like that. Left outside, if you please, and me go away. He's eating, sir, something awful." There came a piping bawl from inside the door. "That Formalin?" "That you, Pyecraft?" I shouted, and went and banged the door. "Tell her to go away." I did. Then I could hear a curious pattering upon the door, almost like someone feeling for the handle in the dark, and Pyecraft's familiar grunts. "It's all right," I said. "She's gone." But for a long time the door didn't open. I heard the key turn. Then Pyecraft's voice said, "Come in." I turned the handle and opened the door. Naturally, I expected to see Pyecraft. Well, you know, he wasn't there. I never had such a shock in my life. There was his sitting room, in a state of untidy disorder, plates and dishes among the books and writing things, and several chairs overturned, but Pyecraft? "It's all right, old man, shut the door," he said, and then I discovered him. There he was, right up close to the cornice, in the corner by the door, as though someone had glued him to the ceiling. His face was anxious and angry. He panted and gesticulated. "Shut the door," he said. "If that woman gets hold of it." I shut the door and went and stood away from him and stared. "If anything gives way and you tumble down," I said, "you'll break your neck, Pyecraft." "I wish I could," he wheezed. "A man of your age and weight getting up to kiddish gymnastics?" "Don't," he said, and looked agonised. "I'll tell you," he said, and gesticulated. "How the deuce," said I, "are you holding on up there?" And then abruptly I realised that he was not holding on at all, that he was floating up there, just as a gas-filled bladder might have floated in the same position. He began a struggle to thrust himself away from the ceiling and to clamber down the wall to me. "It's that prescription," he panted as he did so. Your great-gran—" He took hold of a framed engraving rather carelessly as he spoke, and it gave way, and he flew back up to the ceiling again, while the picture smashed onto the sofa. Bump he went against the ceiling, and I knew then why he was all over white on the more salient curves and angles of his person. He tried again more carefully, coming down by way of the mantel. It was really a most extraordinary spectacle. That great, fat, apoplectic-looking man upside down and trying to get from the ceiling to the floor. "That prescription," he said. "Too successful. How? Loss of weight almost complete." And then, of course, I understood. "By Jove, Pyecraft," said I, "what you wanted was a cure for fatness, but you always called it weight. You would call it weight." Somehow I was extremely delighted. I quite liked Pyecraft for the time. "Let me help you," I said, and took his hand and pulled him down. He kicked about, trying to get foothold somewhere. It was very like holding a flag on a windy day. "That table," he said, pointing, "is solid mahogany and very heavy. If you can put me under that." I did, and there he wallowed about like a captive balloon, while I stood on his hearthrug and talked to him. I lit a cigar. "Tell me," I said, "what happened?" "I took it," he said. "How did it taste?" "Oh, beastly." I should fancy they all did, whether one regards the ingredients, or the probable compound, or the possible results. Almost all my great-grandmother's remedies appear, to me at least, to be extraordinarily uninviting. For my own part, I took a little sip first. "Yes?" "And as I felt lighter and better after an hour, I decided to take the draught." "My dear Pyecraft!" "I held my nose," he explained, "and then I kept on getting lighter and lighter, and helpless, you know." He gave way suddenly to a burst of passion. "What the goodness am I to do?" he said. "There's one thing pretty evident," I said, "that you mustn't do. If you go out of doors, you'll go up and up." I waved an arm upward. "They'd have to send Santos Dumont after you to bring you down again." "I suppose it will wear off." I shook my head. "I don't think you can count on that," I said. And then there was another burst of passion, and he kicked out at adjacent chairs and banged the floor. He behaved just as I should have expected a great, fat, self-indulgent man to behave under trying circumstances. That is to say, very badly. He spoke of me and of my great-grandmother with an utter want of discretion. "I never asked you to take the stuff," I said, and, generously disregarding the insults he was putting upon me, I sat down in his armchair and began to talk to him in a sober, friendly fashion. I pointed out to him that this was a trouble he had brought upon himself, and that it had almost an air of poetical justice. He had eaten too much. This he disputed, and for a time we argued the point. He became noisy and violent, so I desisted from this aspect of his lesson. "And then," said I, "you committed the sin of euphuism. You called it not fat, which is just and inglorious, but weight. You—" He interrupted to say that he recognised all that. What was he to do? I suggested he should adapt himself to his new conditions. So we came to the really sensible part of the business. I suggested that it would not be difficult for him to learn to walk about on the ceiling with his hands. "I can't sleep," he said. But that was no great difficulty. It was quite possible, I pointed out, to make a shake-up under a wire mattress, fasten the underthings on with tapes, and have a blanket, sheet, and coverlet to button at the side. He would have to confide in his housekeeper, I said, and, after some squabbling, he agreed to that. Afterwards it was quite delightful to see the beautifully matter-of-fact way with which the good lady took all these amazing inversions. He could have a library ladder in his room, and all his meals could be laid on the top of his bookcase. We also hit on an ingenious device by which he could get to the floor whenever he wanted, which was simply to put the British Encyclopaedia, 10th edition, on the top of his open shelves. He just pulled out a couple of volumes and held on, and down he came. And we agreed that there must be iron staples along the skirting, so that he could cling to those whenever he wanted to get about the room on the lower level. As we got on with the thing, I found myself almost keenly interested. It was I who called in the housekeeper and broke matters to her, and it was I, chiefly, who fixed up the inverted bed. In fact, I spent 2 whole days at his flat. I am a handy, interfering sort of man with a screwdriver, and I made all sorts of ingenious adaptations for him, ran a wire to bring his bells within reach, turned all his electric lights up instead of down, and so on. The whole affair was extremely curious and interesting to me, and it was delightful to think of Pyecraft like some great fat blowfly crawling about on his ceiling and clambering around the lintel of his doors from one room to another, and never coming to the club any more. Then, my fatal ingenuity got the better of me. I was sitting by his fire drinking his whisky, and he was up in his favourite corner by the cornice, tacking a Turkey carpet to the ceiling, when the idea struck me. "By Jove, Pyecraft," I said, "all this is totally unnecessary." And before I could calculate the complete consequences of my notion, I blurted it out. "Lead underclothing," said I, and the mischief was done. Pyecraft received the thing almost in tears. "To be right ways up again," he said. I gave him the whole secret before I saw where it would take me. "Buy sheet lead," I said, "stamp it into discs, sew 'em all over your underclothes until you have enough. Have lead-soled boots, carry a bag of solid lead, and the thing is done. Instead of being a prisoner here, you may go abroad again, Pyecraft. You may travel." A still happier idea came to me. You need never fear a shipwreck. All you need do is just slip off some or all of your clothes, take the necessary amount of luggage in your hand, and float up in the air. In his emotion he dropped the tack hammer within an ace of my head. "By Jove," he said, "I shall be able to come back to the club again." The thing pulled me up short. "By Jove," I said faintly. "Yes, of course you will." He did. He does. There he sits behind me now, stuffing, as I live, a 3rd go of buttered tea cake, and no one in the whole world knows, except his housekeeper and me, that he weighs practically nothing, that he is a mere boring mass of assimilatory matter, mere clouds in clothing, niente nefas, the most inconsiderable of men. There he sits watching until I have done this writing. Then, if he can, he will waylay me. He will come billowing up to me. He will tell me over again all about it, how it feels, how it doesn't feel, how he sometimes hopes it is passing off a little, and always, somewhere in that fat, abundant discourse, he will say, "The secret's keeping, eh? If anyone knew of it, I should be so ashamed. Makes a fellow look such a fool, crawling about on a ceiling and all that." And now to elude Pyecraft, occupying as he does an admirable strategic position between me and the door. End of section 28. Section 29 of The Country of the Blind and Other Stories by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Yearsley. The Magic Shop. I had seen the magic shop from afar several times. I had passed it once or twice, a shop window of alluring little objects, magic balls, magic hens, wonderful cones, ventriloquist dolls, the material of the basket trick, packs of cards that looked all right, and all that sort of thing. But never had I thought of going in until one day, almost without warning, Jip hauled me by my finger right up to the window, and so conducted himself that there was nothing for it but to take him in. I had not thought the place was there, to tell the truth. A modest-sized frontage in Regent Street, between the picture shop and the place where the chicks run about, just out of patent incubators. But there it was, sure enough. I had fancied it was down nearer the circus, or round the corner in Oxford Street, or even in Holborn. Always over the way, and a little inaccessible it had been, with something of the mirage in its position. But here it was now, quite indisputably, and the fat end of Jip's pointing finger made a noise upon the glass. "If I was rich," said Jip, dabbing a finger at the disappearing egg. I'd buy myself that, and that, which was the crying baby, very human, and that, which was a mystery, and called, so a neat card asserted, "Buy one and astonish your friends." "Anything," said Jip, "will disappear under one of those cones. I've read about it in a book. And there, Dada, is the vanishing halfpenny, only they've put it this way up, so's we can't see how it's done." Jip, dear boy, inherits his mother's breeding, and he did not propose to enter the shop or worry in any way, only, quite unconsciously, he lugged my finger doorward, and he made his interest clear. "That," he said, and pointed to the magic bottle. "If you had that," I said, at which promising inquiry he looked up with a sudden radiance. "I could show it to Jessie," he said, thoughtful, as ever, of others. "It's less than 100 days to your birthday, Gibbles," I said, and laid my hand on the door handle. Jip made no answer, but his grip tightened on my finger, and so we came into the shop. It was no common shop, this. It was a magic shop, and all the prancing precedence Jip would have taken in the matter of mere toys was wanting. He left the burthen of the conversation to me. It was a little narrow shop, not very well lit, and the doorbell pinged again with a plaintive note as we closed it behind us. For a moment or so we were alone and could glance about us. There was a tiger in papier-mâché on the glass case that covered the low counter, a grave, kind-eyed tiger that waggled his head in a methodical manner. There were several crystal spheres, a china hand holding magic cards, a stock of magic fish bowls in various sizes, and an immodest magic hat that shamelessly displayed its springs. On the floor were magic mirrors, one to draw you out long and thin, one to swell your head and vanish your legs, and one to make you short and fat like a draught. And while we were laughing at these, the shopman, as I suppose, came in. At any rate, there he was behind the counter, a curious, sallow, dark man, with one ear larger than the other, and a chin like the toe-cap of a boot. "What can we have the pleasure?" he said, spreading his long magic fingers on the glass case. And so, with a start, we were aware of him. "I want," I said, "to buy my little boy a few simple tricks." "Legerdemain?" he asked. "Mechanical? Domestic?" "Anything amusing?" said I. Said the shopman, and scratched his head for a moment, as if thinking. Then, quite distinctly, he drew from his head a glass ball. "Something in this way?" he said, and held it out. The action was unexpected. I had seen the trick done at entertainments endless times before. It's part of the common stock of conjurers, but I had not expected it here. "That's good," I said with a laugh. "Isn't it?" said the shopman. Jip stretched out his disengaged hand to take this object, and found merely a blank palm. "It's in your pocket," said the shopman, and there it was. "How much will that be?" I asked. "We make no charge for glass balls," said the shopman politely. "We get them—" He picked one out of his elbow as he spoke. "Free." He produced another from the back of his neck and laid it beside its predecessor on the counter. Jip regarded his glass ball sagely, then directed a look of inquiry at the two on the counter, and finally brought his round-eyed scrutiny to the shopman, who smiled. "You may have those two," said the shopman, "and, if you don't mind, one from my mouth. So." Jip counselled me mutely for a moment, and then, in a profound silence, put away the 4 balls, resumed my reassuring finger, and nerved himself for the next event. "We get all our smaller tricks in that way," the shopman remarked. I laughed, in the manner of one who subscribes to a jest. "Instead of going to the wholesale shop," I said. "Of course it's cheaper." "In a way," the shopman said, "though we pay in the end, but not so heavily as people suppose. Our larger tricks and our daily provisions, and all the other things we want, we get out of that hat. And you know, sir, if you'll excuse my saying it, there isn't a wholesale shop. Not for genuine magic goods, sir." I don't know if you noticed our inscription. The Genuine Magic Shop. He drew a business card from his cheek and handed it to me. Genuine, he said, with his finger on the word, and added, There is absolutely no deception, sir. He seemed to be carrying out the joke pretty thoroughly, I thought. He turned to Jip with a smile of remarkable affability. You know, are the right sort of boy. I was surprised at his knowing that, because in the interests of discipline we keep it rather a secret, even at home. But Jip received it in unflinching silence, keeping a steadfast eye on him. It's only the right sort of boy gets through that doorway. And, as if by way of illustration, there came a rattling at the door, and a squeaking little voice could be faintly heard.
Yeah, I want to go in there, Dada. I want to go in there, yeah.
And then the accents of a downtrodden parent, urging consolations and propitiations.
It's locked, Edward,
he said. But it isn't, said I. It is, sir, said the shopman. Always for that sort of child. And as he spoke, we had a glimpse of the other youngster, a little white face, pallid from sweet-eating and over-sapid food, and distorted by evil passions, a ruthless little egotist, pawing at the enchanted pane. It's no good, sir, said the shopman as I moved, with my natural helpfulness, doorward, and presently the spoilt child was carried off howling. How do you manage that? I said, breathing a little more freely. Magic, said the shopman, with a careless wave of the hand, and behold, sparks of coloured fire flew out of his fingers and vanished into the shadows of the shop. You were saying, he said, addressing himself to Jip, before you came in, that you would like one of our Buy One and Astonish Your Friends boxes. Jip, after a gallant effort, said, Yes, it's in your pocket. And, leaning over the counter, he really had an extraordinary long body. This amazing person produced the article in the customary conjurer's manner. Paper, he said, and took a sheet out of the empty hat with the springs. String. And behold, his mouth was a string box, from which he drew an unending thread, which, when he had tied his parcel, he bit off, and it seemed to me swallowed the ball of string. And then he lit a candle at the nose of one of the ventriloquist's dummies, stuck one of his fingers, which had become sealing wax red, into the flame, and so sealed the parcel. Then there was the disappearing egg, he remarked, and produced one from within my coat breast, and packed it, and also the crying baby very human. I handed each parcel to Jip as it was ready, and he clasped them to his chest. He said very little, but his eyes were eloquent. The clutch of his arms was eloquent. He was the playground of unspeakable emotions. These, you know, were real magics. Then, with a start, I discovered something moving about in my hat, something soft and jumpy. I whipped it off, and a ruffled pigeon, no doubt a Confederate, dropped out and ran on the counter, and went, I fancy, into a cardboard box behind the papier-mâché tiger. Said the shopman, dexterously relieving me of my headdress. Careless bird, and, as I live, nesting. He shook my hat, and shook out into his extended hand 2 or 3 eggs, a large marble, a watch, about half a dozen of the inevitable glass balls, and then crumpled, crinkled paper, more and more and more, talking all the time of the way in which people neglect to brush their hats, inside as well as out. Politely, of course, but with a certain personal application. All sorts of things accumulate, sir. Not you, of course, in particular. Nearly every customer. Astonishing what they carry about with them. The crumpled paper rose and billowed on the counter, more and more and more, until he was nearly hidden from us, until he was altogether hidden, and still his voice went on and on. We none of us know what the fair semblance of a human being may conceal, sir. Are we all, then, no better than brushed exteriors, whited sepulchres? His voice stopped, exactly like when you hit a neighbour's gramophone with a well-aimed brick. The same instant silence. and the rustle of the paper stopped, and everything was still. "Have you done with my hat?" I said after an interval. There was no answer. I stared at Jip, and Jip stared at me, and there were our distortions in the magic mirrors, looking very rum and grave and quiet. "I think we'll go now," I said. "Will you tell me how much all this comes to?" "I say," I said, on a rather louder note, "I want the bill, and my hat, please." It might have been a sniff from behind the paper pile. "Let's look behind the counter, Jip," I said. "He's making fun of us." I led Jip round the head-wagging tiger, and what do you think there was behind the counter? No one at all, only my hat on the floor, and a common conjurer's lop-eared white rabbit, lost in meditation, and looking as stupid and crumpled as only a conjurer's rabbit can do. I resumed my hat, and the rabbit lolloped a lollop or so out of my way. "Dada," said Jip in a guilty whisper. "What is it, Jip?" said I. "I do like this shop, Dada." "So should I said to myself, if the counter wouldn't suddenly extend itself to shut one off from the door. But I didn't call Jip's attention to that. "Pussy," he said, with a hand out to the rabbit as it came lolloping past us. "Do Jip a magic." And his eyes followed it as it squeezed through a door I had certainly not remarked a moment before. Then this door opened wider, and the man with one ear larger than the other appeared again. He was smiling still, but his eye met mine with something between amusement and defiance. "You'd like to see our showroom, sir," he said, with an innocent suavity. Jip tugged my finger forward. I glanced at the counter, and met the shopman's eye again. I was beginning to think the magic just a little too genuine. "We haven't very much time," I said, but somehow we were inside the showroom before I could finish that. "All goods of the same quality," said the shopman, rubbing his flexible hands together. "And that is the best. Nothing in the place that isn't genuine magic, and warranted thoroughly rum. Excuse me, sir." I felt him pull at something that clung to my coat sleeve, and then I saw he held a little wriggling red demon by the tail. The little creature bit and fought and tried to get at his hand, and in a moment he tossed it carelessly behind a counter. No doubt the thing was only an image of twisted india rubber, but for the moment... And his gesture was exactly that of a man who handles some petty, biting bit of vermin. I glanced at Jip, but Jip was looking at a magic rocking horse. I was glad he hadn't seen the thing. "I say," I said in an undertone, and indicating Jip and the red demon with my eyes, "you haven't many things like that about, have you?" "None of ours." "Probably brought it with you," said the shopman, also in an undertone, and with a more dazzling smile than ever. "Astonishing what people will carry about with them unawares." And then to Jip, "Do you see anything you fancy here?" There were many things that Jip fancied there. He turned to this astonishing tradesman with mingled confidence and respect. "Is that a magic sword?" he said. "A magic toy sword. It neither bends, breaks, nor cuts the fingers. It renders the bearer invincible in battle against anyone under 18. Half a crown to 7 6pence, according to size. These panoplies on cards are for juvenile knights errant, and very useful. Shield of safety, sandals of swiftness, helmet of invisibility." "Oh, Dada!" gasped Jip. I tried to find out what they cost, but the shopman did not heed me. He had got Jip now. He had got him away from my finger. He had embarked upon the exposition of all his confounded stock, and nothing was going to stop him. Presently I saw, with a qualm of distrust and something very like jealousy, that Jip had hold of this person's finger, as usually he has hold of mine. No doubt the fellow was interesting, I thought, and had an interestingly faked lot of stuff, really good faked stuff, still. I wandered after them, saying very little, but keeping an eye on this press-digital fellow. After all, Jip was enjoying it, and no doubt when the time came to go, we should all be able to go quite easily. It was a long, rambling place, that showroom, a gallery broken up by stands and stalls and pillars, with archways leading off to other departments, in which the queerest-looking assistants loafed and stared at one, and with perplexing mirrors and curtains, so perplexing indeed were these, that I was presently unable to make out the door by which we had come. The shopman showed Jip magic trains that ran without steam or clockwork, just as you set the signals, and then some very, very valuable boxes of soldiers that all came alive directly you took off the lid and said. I myself haven't a very quick ear, and it was a tongue-twisting sound, but Jip, he has his mother's ear, got it in no time. "Bravo!" said the shopman, putting the men back into the box unceremoniously, and handing it to Jip. "Now," said the shopman, and in a moment Jip had made them all alive again. "You'll take that box?" asked the shopman. "We'll take that box," said I. "Unless you charge its full value, in which case it would need a trust magnate." "Dear heart, no!" And the shopman swept the little men back again, shut the lid, waved the box in the air, and there it was, in brown paper, tied up, and with Jip's full name and address on the paper. The shopman laughed at my amazement. "This is the genuine magic," he said, "the real thing." "It's a little too genuine for my taste," I said again. After that he fell to showing Jip tricks, odd tricks, and still odder the way they were done. He explained them, he turned them inside out, and there was the dear little chap nodding his busy bit of a head in the sagest manner. I did not attend as well as I might. "Hey presto!" said the magic shopman, and then would come the clear, small "Hey presto!" of the boy. But I was distracted by other things. It was being borne in upon me just how tremendously rum this place was. It was, so to speak, inundated by a sense of rumness. There was something a little rum about the fixtures even, about the ceiling, about the floor, about the casually distributed chairs. I had a queer feeling that whenever I wasn't looking at them straight, they went askew, and moved about, and played a noiseless puss-in-the-corner behind my back. And the cornice had a serpentine design with masks altogether too expressive for proper plaster. Then abruptly my attention was caught by one of the odd-looking assistants. He was some way off, and evidently unaware of my presence. I saw a sort of three-quarter length of him over a pile of toys and through an arch, and, you know, he was leaning against a pillar in an idle sort of way, doing the most horrid things with his features. The particular horrid thing he did was with his nose. He did it just as though he was idle and wanted to amuse himself. First of all it was a short blobby nose, and then suddenly he shot it out like a telescope, and then out it flew, and became thinner and thinner until it was like a long red flexible whip. Like a thing in a nightmare it was. He flourished it about and flung it forth as a fly-fisher flings his line. My instant thought was that Jip mustn't see him. I turned about, and there was Jip, quite preoccupied with the shopman, and thinking no evil. They were whispering together and looking at me. Jip was standing on a little stool, and the shopman was holding a sort of big drum in his hand. "Hide and seek, Dada," cried Jip. "You're he." And before I could do anything to prevent it, the shopman had clapped the big drum over him. I saw what was up directly. "Take that off," I cried. "This instant. You'll frighten the boy. Take it off." The shopman with the unequal ears did so without a word, and held the big cylinder towards me to show its emptiness, and the little stool was vacant. In that instant my boy had utterly disappeared. You know, perhaps, that sinister something that comes like a hand out of the unseen and grips your heart about. You know, it takes your common self away and leaves you tense and deliberate, neither slow nor hasty, neither angry nor afraid. So it was with me. I came up to this grinning shopman and kicked his stool aside. "Stop this folly," I said. "Where is my boy?" "You see," he said, still displaying the drum's interior, "there is no deception." I put out my hand to grip him, and he eluded me by a dexterous movement. I snatched again, and he turned from me and pushed open a door to escape. "Stop," I said, and he laughed, receding. I leapt after him into utter darkness. Thud! Lord bless my heart, I didn't see you coming, sir. I was in Regent Street, and I had collided with a decent-looking working man, and a yard away perhaps, and looking a little perplexed with himself, was Jip. There was some sort of apology, and then Jip had turned and come to me with a bright little smile, as though for a moment he had missed me. And he was carrying 4 parcels in his arm. He secured immediate possession of my finger. For the second I was rather at a loss. I stared round to see the door of the magic shop, and behold, it was not there. There was no door, no shop, nothing, only the common pilaster between the shop where they sell pictures and the window with the chicks. I did the only thing possible in that mental tumult. I walked straight to the curbstone and held up my umbrella for a cab. "'Ansoms," said Jip, in a note of culminating exultation. I helped him in, recalled my address with an effort, and got in also. Something unusual proclaimed itself in my tailcoat pocket, and I felt and discovered a glass ball. With a petulant expression, I flung it into the street. Jip said nothing. For a space, neither of us spoke. "Dada," said Jip at last, "that was a proper shop." I came round with that to the problem of just how the whole thing had seemed to him. He looked completely undamaged. So far, good. He was neither scared nor unhinged. He was simply tremendously satisfied with the afternoon's entertainment, and there in his arms were the 4 parcels. Confound it, what could be in them? I said. "Little boys can't go to shops like that every day." He received this with his usual stoicism, and for a moment I was sorry I was his father and not his mother, and so couldn't suddenly there, coram publico, in our hansom, kiss him. After all, I thought, the thing wasn't so very bad. But it was only when we opened the parcels that I really began to be reassured. 3 of them contained boxes of soldiers, quite ordinary lead soldiers, but of so good a quality as to make Jip altogether forget that originally these parcels had been magic tricks of the only genuine sort. And the 4th contained a kitten, a little living white kitten, in excellent health and appetite and temper. I saw this unpacking with a sort of provisional relief. I hung about in the nursery for quite an unconscionable time. That happened 6 months ago, and now I am beginning to believe it is all right. The kitten had only the magic natural to all kittens, and the soldiers seemed as steady a company as any colonel could desire. And Jip, the intelligent parent, will understand that I have to go cautiously with Jip. But I went so far as this one day. I said, "How would you like your soldiers to come alive, Jip, and march about by themselves?" "Mine do," said Jip. "I just have to say a word I know before I open the lid." "Then they march about alone?" "Oh, quite, Dada. I shouldn't like them if they didn't do that." I displayed no unbecoming surprise, and since then I have taken occasion to drop in upon him once or twice unannounced when the soldiers were about, but so far I have never discovered them performing in anything like a magical manner. It's so difficult to tell. There's also a question of finance. I have an incurable habit of paying bills. I have been up and down Regent Street several times looking for that shop. I am inclined to think, indeed, that in that manner honour is satisfied, and that, since Jip's name and address are known to them, I may very well leave it to these people, whoever they may be, to send in their bill in their own time. End of section 29. Section 30 of The Country of the Blind and Other Stories by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Peter Yearsley. The Empire of the Ants. When Captain Guerriot received instructions to take his new gunboat, the Benjamin Constant, to Badama on the Batamo arm of the Guaramadema, and there assist the inhabitants against a plague of ants, he suspected the authorities of mockery. His promotion had been romantic and irregular. The affections of a prominent Brazilian lady and the captain's liquid eyes had played a part in the process, and the Diario and O Futuro had been lamentably disrespectful in their comments. He felt he was to give further occasion for disrespect. He was a Creole. His conceptions of etiquette and discipline were pure-blooded Portuguese, and it was only to Holroyd, the Lancashire engineer who had come over with the boat, and as an exercise in the use of English, his th sounds were very uncertain, that he opened his heart. "It is in effect," he said, "to make me absurd. What can a man do against ants? They come, they go." "They say," said Holroyd, "that these don't go. That chap you said was a Sambo." "Zambo. It is a sort of mixture of blood." "Sambo. He said the people are going." The captain smoked fretfully for a time. "These things have to happen," he said at last. "What is it? Plagues of ants and such like as God wills. There was a plague in Trinidad. The little ants that carry leaves. All the orange trees, all the mangoes. What does it matter? Sometimes ant armies come into your houses. Fighting ants, a different sort. You go, and they clean the house. Then you come back again, the house is clean, like new. No cockroaches, no fleas, no jiggers in the floor." "That Sambo chap," said Holroyd, "says these are a different sort of ant." The captain shrugged his shoulders, fumed, and gave his attention to a cigarette. Afterwards he reopened the subject. "My dear Holroyd, what am I to do about these infernal ants?" The captain reflected. "It is ridiculous," he said. But in the afternoon he put on his full uniform and went ashore, and jars and boxes came back to the ship, and subsequently he did. And Holroyd sat on the deck in the evening coolness, and smoked profoundly, and marvelled at Brazil. They were 6 days up the Amazon, some hundreds of miles from the ocean, and east and west of him there was a horizon like the sea, and to the south nothing but a sandbank island with some tufts of scrub. The water was always running like a sluice, thick with dirt, animated with crocodiles and hovering birds, and fed by some inexhaustible source of tree trunks, and the waste of it, the headlong waste of it, filled his soul. The town of Alemquer, with its meagre church, its thatched sheds for houses, its discoloured ruins of ampler days, seemed a little thing lost in this wilderness of nature, a sixpence dropped on Sahara. He was a young man. This was his first sight of the tropics. He came straight from England, where nature is hedged, ditched, and drained into the perfection of submission, and he had suddenly discovered the insignificance of man. For 6 days they had been steaming up from the sea by unfrequented channels, and man had been as rare as a rare butterfly. One saw one day a canoe, another day a distant station, the next no men at all. He began to perceive that man is indeed a rare animal, having but a precarious hold upon this land. He perceived it more clearly as the days passed, and he made his devious way to the Batamo in the company of this remarkable commander, who ruled over one big gun and was forbidden to waste his ammunition. Holroyd was learning Spanish industriously, but he was still in the present tense and substantive stage of speech, and the only other person who had any words of English was a negro stoker, who had them all wrong. The second in command was a Portuguese, da Cunha, who spoke French, but it was a different sort of French from the French Holroyd had learned in Southport, and their intercourse was confined to politenesses and simple propositions about the weather. And the weather, like everything else in this amazing new world, the weather had no human aspect, and was hot by night and hot by day, and the air steam, even the wind was hot steam, smelling of vegetation in decay, and the alligators and the strange birds, the flies of many sorts and sizes, the beetles, the ants, the snakes and monkeys, seemed to wonder what man was doing in an atmosphere that had no gladness in its sunshine and no coolness in its night. To wear clothing was intolerable, but to cast it aside was to scorch by day and expose an ampler area to the mosquitoes by night. To go on deck by day was to be blinded by glare, and to stay below was to suffocate. And in the daytime came certain flies, extremely clever and noxious about one's wrist and ankle. Captain Guerriot, who was Holroyd's sole distraction from these physical distresses, developed into a formidable bore, telling the simple story of his heart's affections day by day, a string of anonymous women, as if he was telling beads. Sometimes he suggested sport, and they shot at alligators, and at rare intervals they came to human aggregations in the waste of trees, and stayed for a day or so, and drank and sat about, and one night danced with the Creole girls, who found Holroyd's poor elements of Spanish, without either past tense or future, amply sufficient for their purposes. But these were mere luminous chinks in the long grey passage of the streaming river, up which the throbbing engines beat. A certain liberal heathen deity, in the shape of a demi-John, held seductive court aft, and, it is probable, forward. But Guerriot learned things about the ants, more things and more, at this stopping place and that, and became interested in his mission. "They are a new sort of ant," he said. "We have got to be, what do you call it, entomology? Big, 5 centimetres. Some bigger. It is ridiculous. We are like the monkeys, sent to pick insects. But they are eating up the country." He burst out indignantly. "Suppose suddenly there are complications with Europe. Here am I. Soon we shall be above the Rio Negro, and my gun useless." He nursed his knee and mused. "Those people who were there at the dancing place, they have come down. They have lost all they got. The ants come to their house one afternoon. Everyone run out. You know when the ants come, one must. Everyone runs out and they go over the house. If you stayed, they'd eat you. See? Well, presently they go back. They say, the ants have gone. The ants haven't gone. They try to go in. The sun, he goes in. The ants fight. Swarm over him? Bite him. Presently he comes out again, screaming and running. He runs past them to the river. See, he gets into the water and drowns the ants. Yes." Guerriot paused, brought his liquid eyes close to Holroyd's face, tapped Holroyd's knee with his knuckle. "That night he dies, just as if he was stung by a snake." "Poisoned? By the ants?" "Who knows?" Guerriot shrugged his shoulders. "Perhaps they bit him badly. When I joined this service, I joined to fight men. These things, these ants, they come and go. It is no business for men." After that he talked frequently of the ants to Holroyd, and whenever they chanced to drift against any speck of humanity in that waste of water and sunshine and distant trees, Holroyd's improving knowledge of the language enabled him to recognise the ascendant word sauber more and more completely dominating the whole. He perceived the ants were becoming interesting, and the nearer he drew to them, the more interesting they became. Guerriot abandoned his old themes almost suddenly, and the Portuguese lieutenant became a conversational figure. He knew something about the leaf-cutting ant, and expanded his knowledge. Guerriot sometimes rendered what he had to tell to Holroyd. He told of the little workers that swarm and fight, and the big workers that command and rule, and how these latter always crawled to the neck, and how their bites drew blood. He told how they cut leaves and made fungus beds, and how their nests in Caracas are sometimes 100 yards across. 2 days the 3 men spent disputing whether ants have eyes. The discussion grew dangerously heated on the second afternoon, and Holroyd saved the situation by going ashore in a boat to catch ants and see. He captured various specimens and returned, and some had eyes and some hadn't. Also, they argued, do ants bite or sting? "These ants," said Guerriot, after collecting information at a rancho, "have big eyes. They don't run about blind, not as most ants do. No, they get in corners and watch what you do." "And they sting?" asked Holroyd. "Yes, they sting, There is poison in the sting. He meditated. I do not see what men can do against ants. They come and go. But these don't go. They will, said Gergio. Past Tamandu there is a long, low coast of 80 miles, without any population, and then one comes to the confluence of the main river and the Batamo arm, like a great lake, and then the forest came nearer, came at last intimately near. The character of the channel changes. Snags abound, and the Benjamin Constant moored by a cable that night, under the very shadow of dark trees. For the first time for many days came a spell of coolness, and Holroyd and Gergio sat late, smoking cigars and enjoying this delicious sensation. Gergio's mind was full of ants and what they could do. He decided to sleep at last, and lay down on a mattress on deck, a man hopelessly perplexed. His last words, when he already seemed asleep, were to ask, with a flourish of despair, "What can one do with ants? The whole thing is absurd." Holroyd was left to scratch his bitten wrists and meditate alone. He sat on the bulwark and listened to the little changes in Gergio's breathing until he was fast asleep, and then the ripple and lap of the stream took his mind and brought back that sense of immensity that had been growing upon him since first he had left Para and come up the river. The monitor showed but one small light, and there was first a little talking forward, and then stillness. His eyes went from the dim black outlines of the middle works of the gunboat towards the bank, to the black, overwhelming mysteries of forest, lit now and then by a firefly, and never still from the murmur of alien and mysterious activities. It was the inhuman immensity of this land that astonished and oppressed him. He knew the skies were empty of men, the stars were specks in an incredible vastness of space. He knew the ocean was enormous and untamable. But in England he had come to think of the land as man's. In England it is indeed man's. The wild things live by sufferance, grow on lease. Everywhere the roads, the fences, and absolute security runs. In an atlas, too, the land is man's, and all coloured to show his claim to it, in vivid contrast to the universal independent blueness of the sea. He had taken it for granted that a day would come when everywhere about the earth plough and culture, light tramways and good roads, and ordered security would prevail. But now he doubted. This forest was interminable. It had an air of being invincible, and man seemed at best an infrequent, precarious intruder. One travelled for miles amidst the still, silent struggle of giant trees, of strangulating creepers, of assertive flowers. Everywhere the alligator, the turtle, and endless varieties of birds and insects seemed at home, dwelt irreplaceably, but man at most, held a footing upon resentful clearings, fought weeds, fought beasts and insects for the barest foothold, fell a prey to snake and beast, insect and fever, and was presently carried away. In many places down the river he had been manifestly driven back. This deserted creek or that preserved the name of a casa, and here and there ruinous white walls and a shattered tower enforced the lesson. The puma, the jaguar, were more the masters here. Who were the real masters? In a few miles of this forest there must be more ants than there are men in the whole world. This seemed to Holroyd a perfectly new idea. In a few thousand years men had emerged from barbarism to a state of civilization that made them feel lords of the future and masters of the earth. But what was to prevent the ants evolving also? Such ants as one knew lived in little communities of a few thousand individuals, made no concerted efforts against the greater world. But they had a language, they had an intelligence. Why should things stop at that, any more than men had stopped at the barbaric stage? Suppose presently the ants began to store knowledge, just as men had done by means of books and records, use weapons, form great empires, sustain a planned and organized war. Things came back to him that Geriot had gathered about these ants they were approaching. They used a poison like the poison of snakes. They obeyed greater leaders, even as the leaf-cutting ants do. They were carnivorous, and where they came they stayed. The forest was very still. The water lapped incessantly against the side. About the lantern overhead there eddied a noiseless whirl of phantom moths. Geriot stirred in the darkness and sighed. "What can one do?" he murmured, and turned over and was still again. Holroyd was roused from meditations that were becoming sinister by the hum of a mosquito. Part 2. The next morning Holroyd learnt they were within 40 kilometres of Badama, and his interest in the banks intensified. He came up whenever an opportunity offered to examine his surroundings. He could see no signs of human occupation whatever, save for a weedy ruin of a house and the green-stained façade of the long-deserted monastery at Maudu, with a forest tree growing out of a vacant window space, and great creepers netted across its vacant portals. Several flights of strange yellow butterflies with semi-transparent wings crossed the river that morning, and many alighted on the monitor and were killed by the men. It was towards afternoon that they came upon the derelict Cuberta. She did not at first appear to be derelict. Both her sails were set and hanging slack in the afternoon calm, and there was the figure of a man sitting on the fore-planking beside the shipped sweeps. Another man appeared to be sleeping face downwards on the sort of longitudinal bridge these big canoes have in the waist, but it was presently apparent, from the sway of her rudder and the way she drifted into the course of the gunboat, that something was out of order with her. Geriot surveyed her through a field-glass, and became interested in the queer darkness of the face of the sitting man. A red-faced man he seemed, without a nose. Crouching he was rather than sitting, and the longer the captain looked, the less he liked to look at him, and the less able he was to take his glasses away. But he did so at last, and went a little way to call up Holroyd. Then he went back to hail the Cuberta. He hailed her again, and so she drove past him. Santa Rosa stood out clearly as her name. As she came by and into the wake of the monitor, she pitched a little, and suddenly the figure of the crouching man collapsed, as though all its joints had given way. His hat fell off, his head was not nice to look at, and his body flopped, lax, and rolled out of sight behind the bulwarks. "Caramba!" cried Geriot, and resorted to Holroyd forthwith. Holroyd was halfway up the companion. "Did you see that?" said the captain. "Dead," said Holroyd. "Yes, you'd better send a boat aboard. There's something wrong." "Did you, by any chance, see his face?" "What was it like?" "It was... I have no words." And the captain suddenly turned his back on Holroyd and became an active and strident commander. The gunboat came about, steamed parallel to the erratic course of the canoe, and dropped the boat with Lieutenant d'Acunha and 3 sailors to board her. Then the curiosity of the captain made him draw up almost alongside as the lieutenant got aboard, so that the whole of the Santa Rosa, deck and hold, was visible to Holroyd. He saw now clearly that the sole crew of the vessel was these 2 dead men, and though he could not see their faces, he saw by their outstretched hands, which were all of ragged flesh, that they had been subjected to some strange exceptional process of decay. For a moment his attention concentrated on those 2 enigmatical bundles of dirty clothes and laxly flung limbs, and then his eyes went forward to discover the open hold, piled high with trunks and cases, and aft to where the little cabin gaped inexplicably empty. Then he became aware that the planks of the middle decking were dotted with moving black specks. His attention was riveted by these specks. They were all walking in directions radiating from the fallen man, in a manner, the image came unsought to his mind, like the crowd dispersing from a bullfight. He became aware of Geriot beside him. "Capot," he said, "can you focus as closely as those planks there?" Geriot made an effort, grunted, and handed him the glasses. There followed a moment of scrutiny. "It's ants," said the Englishman, and handed the focused field-glass back to Geriot. His impression of them was of a crowd of large black ants, very like ordinary ants, except for their size. and for the fact that some of the larger of them bore a sort of clothing of grey, but at the time his inspection was too brief for particulars. The head of Lieutenant da Cunha appeared over the side of the cuberta, and a brief colloquy ensued. "You must go aboard," said Geriot. The lieutenant objected that the boat was full of ants. "You have your boots," said Geriot. The lieutenant changed the subject. "How did those men die?" Captain Geriot embarked upon speculations that Holroyd could not follow, and the two men disputed with a certain increasing vehemence. Holroyd took up the field glass and resumed his scrutiny, first of the ants, and then of the dead man amidships. He has described these ants to me very particularly. He says they were as large as any ants he has ever seen, black, and moving with a steady deliberation very different from the mechanical fussiness of the common ant. About 1 in 20 was much larger than its fellows, and with an exceptionally large head. These reminded him at once of the master workers who are said to rule over the leaf-cutter ants. Like them, they seemed to be directing and coordinating the general movements. They tilted their bodies back in a manner altogether singular, as if they made some use of the forefeet, and he had a curious fancy that he was too far off to verify that most of these ants of both kinds were wearing accoutrements, had things strapped about their bodies by bright white bands, like white metal threads. He put down the glasses abruptly, realizing that the question of discipline between the captain and his subordinate had become acute. "It is your duty," said the captain, "to go aboard. It is my instructions." The lieutenant seemed on the verge of refusing. The head of one of the mulatto's sailors appeared beside him. "I believe these men were killed by the ants," said Holroyd abruptly in English. The captain burst into a rage. He made no answer to Holroyd. "I have commanded you to go aboard," he screamed to his subordinate in Portuguese. "If you do not go aboard forthwith, it is mutiny, rank mutiny, mutiny and cowardice. Where is the courage that should animate us? I will have you in irons, I will have you shot like a dog." He began a torrent of abuse and curses. He danced to and fro. He shook his fists. He behaved as if beside himself with rage, and the lieutenant, white and still, stood looking at him. The crew appeared forward, with amazed faces. Suddenly, in a pause of this outbreak, the lieutenant came to some heroic decision, saluted, drew himself together, and clambered upon the deck of the cuberta. "Ah!" said Geriot, and his mouth shut like a trap. Holroyd saw the ants retreating before da Cunha's boots. The Portuguese walked slowly to the fallen man, stooped down, hesitated, clutched his coat, and turned him over. A black swarm of ants rushed out of the clothes, and da Cunha stepped back very quickly and trod 2 or 3 times on the deck. Holroyd put up the glasses. He saw the scattered ants about the invader's feet, and doing what he had never seen ants doing before. They had nothing of the blind movements of the common ant. They were looking at him as a rallying crowd of men might look at some gigantic monster that had dispersed it. "How did he die?" the captain shouted. Holroyd understood the Portuguese to say the body was too much eaten to tell. "What is there for'ard?" asked Geriot. The lieutenant walked a few paces and began his answer in Portuguese. He stopped abruptly and beat off something from his leg. He made some peculiar steps, as if he was trying to stamp on something invisible, and went quickly towards the side. Then he controlled himself, turned about, walked deliberately forward to the hold, clambered up to the fore-decking from which the sweeps are worked, stooped for a time over the second man, groaned audibly, and made his way back and aft to the cabin, moving very rigidly. He turned and began a conversation with his captain, cold and respectful in tone on either side, contrasting vividly with the wrath and insult of a few moments before. Holroyd gathered only fragments of its purport. He reverted to the field-glass, and was surprised to find the ants had vanished from all the exposed surfaces of the deck. He turned towards the shadows beneath the decking, and it seemed to him they were full of watching eyes. The cuberta, it was agreed, was derelict, but too full of ants to put men aboard to sit and sleep. It must be towed. The lieutenant went forward to take in and adjust the cable, and the men in the boat stood up to be ready to help him. Holroyd's glasses searched the canoe. He became more and more impressed by the fact that a great, if minute and furtive, activity was going on. He perceived that a number of gigantic ants, they seemed nearly a couple of inches in length, carrying oddly shaped burdens for which he could imagine no use, were moving in rushes from one point of obscurity to another. They did not move in columns across the exposed places, but in open, spaced-out lines, oddly suggestive of the rushes of modern infantry advancing under fire. A number were taking cover under the dead man's clothes, and a perfect swarm was gathering along the side over which Dacuna must presently go. He did not see them actually rush for the lieutenant as he returned, but he has no doubt they did make a concerted rush. Suddenly the lieutenant was shouting and cursing and beating at his legs.
I'm stung,
he shouted, with a face of hate and accusation towards Geriot. Then he vanished over the side, dropped into his boat, and plunged at once into the water. Holroyd heard the splash. The 3 men in the boat pulled him out and brought him aboard, and that night he died. Part 3. Holroyd and the captain came out of the cabin in which the swollen and contorted body of the lieutenant lay, and stood together at the stern of the Monitor, staring at the sinister vessel they trailed behind them. It was a close, dark night that had only phantom flickerings of sheet lightning to illuminate it. The Cuberta, a vague black triangle, rocked about in the steamer's wake, her sails bobbing and flapping, and the black smoke from the funnels, spark-lit ever and again, streamed over her swaying masts. Geriot's mind was inclined to run on the unkind things the lieutenant had said in the heat of his last fever.
He says I murdered him,
he protested.
It is simply absurd. Somebody had to go aboard. Are we to run away from these confounded ants whenever they show up?
Holroyd said nothing. He was thinking of a disciplined rush of little black shapes across bare, sunlit planking.
It was his place to go,
harped Geriot.
He died in the execution of his duty. What has he to complain of? Murdered. But the poor fellow was, demented. He was not in his right mind. The poison swelled him. Ugh.
They came to a long silence.
We will sink that canoe, burn it.
And then? The inquiry irritated Geriot. His shoulders went up, his hands flew out at right angles from his body.
What is one to do?
He said, his voice going up to an angry squeak.
Anyhow,
he broke out vindictively,
every ant in that Cuberta, I will burn them alive.
Holroyd was not moved to conversation. A distant ululation of howling monkeys filled the sultry night with foreboding sounds, and as the gunboat drew near the black, mysterious banks, this was reinforced by a depressing clamour of frogs.
What is one to do?
The captain repeated after a vast interval, and suddenly becoming active and savage and blasphemous, decided to burn the Santa Rosa without further delay. Everyone aboard was pleased by that idea. Everyone helped with zest. They pulled in the cable, cut it, and dropped the boat, and fired her with tow and kerosene, and soon the Cuberta was crackling and flaring merrily amidst the immensities of the tropical night. Holroyd watched the mounting yellow flare against the blackness, and the vivid flashes of sheet lightning that came and went above the forest summits, throwing them into momentary silhouette, and his stoker stood behind him, watching also. The stoker was stirred to the depths of his linguistics.
"Sauber go pop, pop,"
he said, and laughed richly. But Holroyd was thinking that these little creatures on the decked canoe had also eyes and brains. The whole thing impressed him as incredibly foolish and wrong, but what was one to do? This question came back enormously reinforced on the morrow, when, at last, the gunboat reached Bedama. This place, with its leaf-thatch-covered houses and sheds, its creeper-invaded sugar-mill, its little jetty of timber and canes, was very still in the morning heat, and showed never a sign of living men. Whatever ants there were at that distance were too small to see.
"All the people have gone," said Geriot, "but we will do one thing anyhow. We will hoot and whistle."
So Holroyd hooted and whistled. Then the captain fell into a doubting fit of the worst kind.
"There is one thing we can do," he said presently.
"What's that?" said Holroyd.
"Hoot and whistle again."
So they did. The captain walked his deck and gesticulated to himself. He seemed to have many things on his mind. Fragments of speeches came from his lips. He appeared to be addressing some imaginary public tribunal, either in Spanish or Portuguese. Holroyd's improving ear detected something about ammunition. He came out of these preoccupations suddenly into English.
"My dear Holroyd," he cried,
and broke off with,
"but what can one do?"
They took the boat and the field glasses and went close in to examine the place. They made out a number of big ants, whose still postures had a certain effect of watching them, dotted about the edge of the rude embarkation jetty. Gerriod tried ineffectual pistol shots at these. Holroyd thinks he distinguished curious earthworks running between the nearer houses, that may have been the work of the insect conquerors of those human habitations. The explorers pulled past the jetty and became aware of a human skeleton wearing a loincloth, and very bright and clean and shining, lying beyond. They came to a pause regarding this.
"I have all those lives to consider,"
said Gerriod suddenly. Holroyd turned and stared at the captain, realizing slowly that he referred to the unappetizing mixture of races that constituted his crew.
"To send a landing party, it is impossible, impossible. They will be poisoned, they will swell up and abuse me and die. It is totally impossible. If we land, I must land alone in thick boots and with my life in my hand. Perhaps I should live. Or again, I might not land. I do not know.
Holroyd thought he did, but he said nothing.
"The whole thing,"
said Gerriod suddenly,
"has been got up to make me ridiculous. The whole thing."
They paddled about and regarded the clean white skeleton from various points of view, and then they returned to the gunboat. Then Gerriod's indecisions became terrible. Steam was got up, and in the afternoon the Monitor went on up the river with an air of going to ask somebody something, and by sunset came back again and anchored. A thunderstorm gathered and broke furiously, and then the night became beautifully cool and quiet, and everyone slept on deck, except Gerriod, who tossed and muttered. In the dawn he awakened Holroyd.
"Lord,"
said Holroyd, "what now?"
"I have decided,"
said the captain.
"What, to land?"
said Holroyd, sitting up brightly.
"No,"
said the captain, and was, for a time, very reserved.
"I have decided,"
he repeated, and Holroyd manifested symptoms of impatience.
"Well, yes,"
said the captain.
"I shall fire the big gun."
And he did. Heaven knows what the ants thought of it, but he did. He fired it twice, with great sternness and ceremony. All the crew had wadding in their ears, and there was an effect of going into action about the whole affair. And first they hit and wrecked the old sugar mill, and then they smashed the abandoned store behind the jetty, and then Gerriod experienced the inevitable reaction.
"It is no good,"
he said to Holroyd.
"No good at all. No sort of bally good. We must go back for instructions. There will be the devil of a row about this ammunition. Oh, the devil of a row. You don't know, Holroyd."
He stood regarding the world in infinite perplexity for a space.
"But what else was there to do?"
he cried. In the afternoon the Monitor started downstream again, and in the evening a landing party took the body of the lieutenant and buried it on the bank upon which the new ants have so far not appeared. Part 4. I heard this story in a fragmentary state from Holroyd not 3 weeks ago. These new ants have got into his brain, and he has come back to England with the idea, as he says, of exciting people about them before it is too late. He says they threaten British Guiana, which cannot be much over a trifle of 1,000 miles from their present sphere of activity, and that the Colonial Office ought to get to work upon them at once. He declaims with great passion, "These are intelligent ants. Just think what that means." There can be no doubt they are a serious pest, and that the Brazilian government is well advised in offering a prize of £500 for some effectual method of extirpation. It is certain, too, that since they first appeared in the hills beyond Bedama about 3 years ago, they have achieved extraordinary conquests. The whole of the south bank of the Potamo River, for nearly 60 miles, they have in their effectual occupation. They have driven men out completely, occupied plantations and settlements, and boarded and captured at least one ship. It is even said they have in some inexplicable way
bridged the very considerable Capuarana arm, and pushed many miles towards the Amazon itself. There can be little doubt that they are far more reasonable and with a far better social organisation than any previously known ant species. Instead of being in dispersed societies, they are organised into what is in effect a single nation. But their peculiar and immediate formidableness lies not so much in this as in the intelligent use they make of poison against their larger enemies. It would seem this poison of theirs is closely akin to snake poison, and it is highly probable they actually manufacture it, and that the larger individuals among them carry the needle-like crystals of it in their attacks upon men. Of course, it is extremely difficult to get any detailed information about these new competitors for the sovereignty of the globe. No eyewitnesses of their activity, except for such glimpses as Holroyd's, have survived the encounter. The most extraordinary legends of their prowess and capacity are in circulation in the region of the upper Amazon, and grow daily as the steady advance of the invader stimulates men's imaginations through their fears. These strange little creatures are credited not only with the use of implements and a knowledge of fire and metals, and with organised feats of engineering that stagger our northern minds, unused as we are to such feats as that of the Saubas of Rio de Janeiro, who in 1841 drove a tunnel under the Paraíba, where it is as wide as the Thames at London Bridge, but with an organised and detailed method of record and communication analogous to our books. So far, their action has been a steady progressive settlement, involving the flight or slaughter of every human being in the new areas they invade. They are increasing rapidly in numbers, and Holroyd at least is firmly convinced that they will finally dispossess man over the whole of tropical South America. And why should they stop at tropical South America? Well, there they are anyhow. By 1911 or thereabouts, if they go on as they are going, they ought to strike the Capuarana Extension Railway and force themselves upon the attention of the European capitalist. By 1920 they will be halfway down the Amazon. I fix 1950 or 60 at the latest for the discovery of Europe. End of chapter 30.
Section 31 of The Country of the Blind and Other Stories by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Peter Yearsley. The Door in the Wall, Part 1. One confidential evening, not 3 months ago, Lionel Wallace told me this story of the door in the wall, and at the time I thought that, so far as he was concerned, it was a true story. He told it me with such a direct simplicity of conviction that I could not do otherwise than believe in him. But in the morning, in my own flat, I woke to a different atmosphere, and as I lay in bed and recalled the things he had told me, stripped of the glamour of his earnest, slow voice, denuded of the focused, shaded table light, the shadowy atmosphere that wrapped around him and me, and the pleasant, bright things, the dessert and glasses and napery of the dinner we had shared, making them for a time a bright little world quite cut off from everyday realities, I saw it all as frankly incredible. "He was mystifying," I said, and then, "How well he did it! It isn't quite the thing I should have expected him, of all people, to do well." Afterwards, as I sat up in bed and sipped my morning tea, I found myself trying to account for the flavour of reality that perplexed me in his impossible reminiscences by supposing they did in some way suggest, present, convey? I hardly know which word to use. Experiences it was otherwise impossible to tell. Well, I don't resort to that explanation now. I have got over my intervening doubts. I believe now, as I believed at the moment of telling, that Wallace did, to the very best of his ability, strip the truth of his secret for me. But whether he himself saw, or only thought he saw, whether he himself was the possessor of an inestimable privilege, or the victim of a fantastic dream, I cannot pretend to guess. Even the facts of his death, which ended my doubts for ever, throw no light on that. That much the reader must judge for himself. I forget now what chance comment or criticism of mine moved so reticent a man to confide in me. He was, I think, defending himself against an imputation of slackness and unreliability I had made in relation to a great public movement in which he had disappointed me. But he plunged suddenly. "I have," he said, "a preoccupation. I know," he went on after a pause, "I have been negligent. The fact is, it isn't a case of ghosts or apparitions, but it's an odd thing to tell of, Redmond. I am haunted. I am haunted by something that rather takes the light out of things, that fills me with longings." He paused, checked by that English shyness that so often overcomes us when we would speak of moving or grave or beautiful things. "You were at St. Athelstan's all through," he said, and for a moment that seemed to me quite irrelevant. "Well," and he paused. Then, very haltingly at first, but afterwards more easily, he began to tell of the thing that was hidden in his life, the haunting memory of a beauty and a happiness that filled his heart with insatiable longings, that made all the interests and spectacle of worldly life seem dull and tedious and vain to him. Now that I have the clue to it, the thing seems written visibly in his face. I have a photograph in which that look of detachment has been caught and intensified. It reminds me of what a woman once said of him, a woman who had loved him greatly. "Suddenly," she said, "the interest goes out of him. He forgets you. He doesn't care a rap for you, under his very nose." Yet the interest was not always out of him, and when he was holding his attention to a thing, Wallace could contrive to be an extremely successful man. His career, indeed, is set with successes. He left me behind him long ago. He soared up over my head, and cut a figure in the world that I couldn't cut anyhow. He was still a year short of 40, and they say now that he would have been in office and very probably in the new cabinet if he had lived. At school he always beat me without effort, as it were by nature. We were at school together at St. Athelstan's College in West Kensington for almost all our school time. He came into the school as my co-equal, but he left, far above me, in a blaze of scholarships and brilliant performance. Yet I think I made a fair average running, and it was at school I heard first of the door in the wall that I was to hear of a second time only a month before his death. To him at least the door in the wall was a real door, leading through a real wall to immortal realities. Of that I am now quite assured. And it came into his life quite early, when he was a little fellow between 5 and 6. I remember how, as he sat making his confession to me with a slow gravity, he reasoned and reckoned with the date of it. There was, he said, a crimson Virginia creeper in it, all one bright uniform crimson, in a clear amber sunshine against a white wall. That came into the impression somehow, though I don't clearly remember how. And there were horse-chestnut leaves upon the clean pavement outside the green door. They were blotched yellow and green, you know, not brown nor dirty, so that they must have been new fallen. I take it that means October. I look out for horse-chestnut leaves every year, and I ought to know. If I'm right in that, I was about 5 years and 4 months old. He was, he said, rather a precocious little boy. He learnt to talk at an abnormally early age, and he was so sane and old-fashioned, as people say, that he was permitted an amount of initiative that most children scarcely attain by 7 or 8. His mother died when he was 2, and he was under the less vigilant and authoritative care of a nursery governess. His father was a stern, preoccupied lawyer, who gave him little attention and expected great things of him. For all his brightness, he found life a little grey and dull, I think, and one day he wandered. He could not recall the particular neglect that enabled him to get away, nor the course he took among the West Kensington roads. All that had faded among the incurable blurs of memory, but the white wall and the green door stood out quite distinctly. As his memory of that childish experience ran, he did, at the very first sight of that door, experience a peculiar emotion, an attraction, a desire to get to the door and open it and walk in, and at the same time he had the clearest conviction that either it was unwise or it was wrong of him, he could not tell which, to yield to this attraction. He insisted upon it as a curious thing that he knew from the very beginning, unless memory has played him the queerest trick, that the door was unfastened, and that he could go in as he chose. I seemed to see the figure of that little boy, drawn and repelled, and it was very clear in his mind too, though why it should be so was never explained, that his father would be very angry if he went in through that door. Wallace described all these moments of hesitation to me with the utmost particularity. He went right past the door, and then, with his hands in his pockets, and making an infantile attempt to whistle, strolled right along beyond the end of the wall. There he recalls a number of mean, dirty shops, and particularly that of a plumber and decorator, with a dusty disorder of earthenware pipes, sheet lead, ball taps, pattern books of wallpaper, and tins of enamel. He stood pretending to examine these things, and coveting, passionately desiring, the green door. Then, he said, he had a gust of emotion. He made a run for it, lest hesitation should grip him again. He went plump with outstretched hand through the green door, and let it slam behind him. And so, in a trice, he came into the garden that has haunted all his life. It was very difficult for Wallace to give me his full sense of that garden into which he came. There was something in the very air of it that exhilarated, that gave one a sense of lightness and good happening and well-being. There was something in the sight of it that made all its colour clean and perfect, and subtly luminous. In the instant of coming into it, one was exquisitely glad, as only in rare moments, and when one is young and joyful, one can be glad in this world, and everything was beautiful there. Wallace mused before he went on telling me. "You see," he said, with the doubtful inflection of a man who pauses at incredible things, "there were 2 great panthers there. Yes, spotted panthers, and I was not afraid. There was a long, wide path with marble-edged flower borders on either side, and these 2 huge velvety beasts were playing there with a ball. One looked up and came towards me, a little curious as it seemed. It came right up to me, rubbed its soft round ear very gently against the small hand I held out, and purred. It was, I tell you, an enchanted garden, I know. And the size? Oh, it stretched far and wide, this way and that. I believe there were hills far away. Heaven knows where West Kensington had suddenly got to. And somehow it was just like coming home. You know, in the very moment the door swung to behind me, I forgot the road with its fallen chestnut leaves, its cabs and tradesmen's carts. I forgot the sort of gravitational pull back to the discipline and obedience of home. I forgot all hesitations and fear, forgot discretion, forgot all the intimate realities of this life. I became, in a moment, a very glad and wonder-happy little boy. In another world. It was a world with a different quality, a warmer, more penetrating and mellower light, with a faint, clear gladness in its air, and wisps of sun-touched cloud in the blueness of its sky. And before me ran this long, wide path, invitingly, with weedless beds on either side, rich with untended flowers, and these two great panthers. I put my little hands fearlessly on their soft fur, and caressed their round ears, and the sensitive corners under their ears, and played with them, and it was as though they welcomed me home. There was a keen sense of home-coming in my mind, and when presently a tall, fair girl appeared in the pathway, and came to meet me, smiling, and said, "Well?" to me, and lifted me, and kissed me, and put me down, and led me by the hand, there was no amazement, but only an impression of delightful rightness, of being reminded of happy things that had, in some strange way, been overlooked. There were broad red steps, I remember, that came into view between spikes of delphinium, and up these we went to a great avenue between very old and shady dark trees. All down this avenue, you know, between the red chapped stems, were marble seats of honour and statuary, and very tame and friendly white doves. Along this cool avenue my girl friend led me, looking down. I recall the pleasant lines, the finely modelled chin of her sweet, kind face, asking me questions in a soft, agreeable voice, and telling me things, pleasant things, I know, though what they were I was never able to recall. Presently a little capuchin monkey, very clean, with a fur of ruddy brown and kindly hazel eyes, came down a tree to us, and ran beside me, looking up at me and grinning, and presently leapt to my shoulder. So we two went on our way in great happiness. He paused. "Go on," I said. "I remember little things. We passed an old man musing among laurels, I remember, and a place gay with parakeets, and came through a broad shaded colonnade to a spacious cool palace, full of pleasant fountains, full of beautiful things, full of the quality and promise of heart's desire. And there were many things and many people, some that still seem to stand out clearly, and some that are a little vague. But all these people were beautiful and kind. In some way, I don't know how, it was conveyed to me that they all were kind to me, glad to have me there, and filling me with gladness by their gestures, by the touch of their hands, by the welcome and love in their eyes. Yes." He mused for a while. Playmates I found there. That was very much to me, because I was a lonely little boy. They played delightful games in a grass-covered court, where there was a sundial set about with flowers, and as one played, one loved... But it's odd, there's a gap in my memory. I don't remember the games we played. I never remembered. Afterwards, as a child, I spent long hours trying, even with tears, to recall the form of that happiness. I wanted to play it all over again, in my nursery by myself. No, all I remember is the happiness, and two dear playfellows who were most with me. Then presently came a sombre, dark woman with a grave, pale face and dreamy eyes, a sombre woman wearing a soft, long robe of pale purple, who carried a book and beckoned and took me aside with her into a gallery above a hall, though my playmates were loath to have me go, and ceased their game, and stood watching as I was carried away. "Come back to us," they cried. "Come back to us soon." I looked up at her face, but she heeded them not at all. Her face was very gentle and grave. She took me to a seat in the gallery, and I stood beside her, ready to look at her book as she opened it upon her knee. The pages fell open. She pointed, and I looked, marvelling, for in the living pages of that book I saw myself. It was a story about myself, and in it were all the things that had happened to me since ever I was born. It was wonderful to me because the pages of that book were not pictures, you understand, but realities. Wallace paused gravely, looked at me doubtfully. "Go on," I said. "I understand." "They were realities. Yes, they must have been. People moved, and things came and went in them. My dear mother, whom I had near forgotten. Then my father, stern and upright. The servants, the nursery, all the familiar things of home. Then the front door and the busy streets, with traffic to and fro. I looked and marvelled, and looked half doubtfully again into the woman's face, and turned the pages over, skipping this and that, to see more of this book and more, and so at last I came to myself, hovering and hesitating, outside the green door in the long white wall, and felt again the conflict and the fear. "And next!" I cried, and would have turned on, but the cool hand of the grave woman delayed me. "Next?" I insisted, and struggled gently with her hand, pulling up her fingers with all my childish strength. And as she yielded, and the page came over, she bent down upon me like a shadow, and kissed my brow. But the page did not show the enchanted garden, nor the panthers, nor the girl who had led me by the hand, nor the playfellows who had been so loath to let me go. It showed a long grey street in West Kensington, in that chill hour of afternoon before the lamps are lit. And I was there, a wretched little figure, weeping aloud, for all that I could do to restrain myself. And I was weeping because I could not return to my dear playfellows who had called after me, "Come back to us, come back to us soon." I was there. This was no page in a book, but harsh reality. That enchanted place and the restraining hand of the grave mother, at whose knee I stood, had gone. Whither had they gone? He halted again, and remained for a time staring into the fire. "Oh, the woefulness of that return," he murmured. "Well?" I said after a minute or so. Poor little wretch I was, brought back to this grey world again. As I realised the fullness of what had happened to me, I gave way to quite ungovernable grief, and the shame and humiliation of that public weeping and my disgraceful home-coming remain with me still. I see again the benevolent-looking old gentleman in gold spectacles, who stopped and spoke to me, prodding me first with his umbrella. "Poor little chap," said he, "and are you lost then?" And me, a London boy of 5 and more, and he must needs bring in a kindly young policeman, and make a crowd of me, and so march me home, sobbing, conspicuous and frightened. I came back from the enchanted garden to the steps of my father's house. That is, as well as I can remember, my vision of that garden, the garden that haunts me still. Of course, I can convey nothing of that indescribable quality of translucent unreality, that difference from the common things of experience that hung about it all. But that is what happened. If it was a dream, I am sure it was a daytime and altogether extraordinary dream. Naturally there followed a terrible questioning by my aunt, my father, the nurse, the governess, everyone. I tried to tell them, and my father gave me my first thrashing for telling lies. When afterwards I tried to tell my aunt, she punished me again for my wicked persistence. Then, as I said, everyone was forbidden to listen to me, to hear a word about it. Even my fairy tale books were taken away from me for a time, because I was too imaginative. Yes, they did that. My father belonged to the old school, and my story was driven back upon myself. I whispered it to my pillow that was often damp and salt to my whispering lips with childish tears, and I added always to my official and less fervent prayers this one heartfelt request. Please, God, I may dream of the garden. Oh, take me back to my garden. Take me back to my garden. I dreamt often of the garden. I may have added to it, I may have changed it, I do not know. All this, you understand, is an attempt to reconstruct from fragmentary memories a very early experience. Between that and the other consecutive memories of my boyhood there is a gulf. A time came when it seemed impossible I should ever speak of that wonder glimpse again. I asked an obvious question. No, he said, I don't remember that I ever attempted to find my way back to the garden in those early years. This seems odd to me now, but I think that very probably a closer watch was kept on my movements after this misadventure to prevent my going astray. No, it wasn't till you knew me that I tried for the garden again, and I believe there was a period, incredible as it seems now, when I forgot the garden altogether. When I was about 8 or 9, it may have been. Do you remember me as a kid at St. Ethelstan's? Rather. I didn't show any signs, did I, in those days of having a secret dream? Part 2. He looked up with a sudden smile. Did you ever play Northwest Passage with me? No, of course, you didn't come my way. It was the sort of game, he went on, that every imaginative child plays all day. The idea was the discovery of a Northwest Passage to school. The way to school was plain enough. The game consisted in finding some way that wasn't plain, starting off 10 minutes early in some almost hopeless direction, and working my way round through unaccustomed streets to my goal. And one day I got entangled among some rather low-class streets on the other side of Campden Hill, and I began to think that for once the game would be against me, and that I should get to school late. I tried rather desperately a street that seemed a cul-de-sac, and found a passage at the end. I hurried through that with renewed hope. I shall do it yet, I said, and passed a row of frowsy little shops that were inexplicably familiar to me, and behold, there was my long white wall, and the green door that led to the enchanted garden. The thing whacked upon me suddenly. Then, after all, that garden, that wonderful garden, wasn't a dream. He paused. I suppose my second experience with the green door marks the world of difference there is between the busy life of a schoolboy and the infinite leisure of a child. Anyhow, this second time I didn't for a moment think of going in straight away. You see, for one thing, my mind was full of the idea of getting to school in time, set on not breaking my record for punctuality. I must surely have felt some little desire, at least, to try the door. Yes, I must have felt that. But I seem to remember the attraction of the door mainly as another obstacle to my overmastering determination to get to school. I was immensely interested by this discovery I had made, of course. I went on with my mind full of it. But I went on. It didn't check me. I ran past, tugging out my watch, found I had 10 minutes still to spare, and then I was going downhill into familiar surroundings. I got to school, breathless it is true, and wet with perspiration, but in time. I can remember hanging up my coat and hat. Went right by it and left it behind me. Odd, eh? He looked at me thoughtfully. Of course, I didn't know then that it wouldn't always be there. Schoolboys have limited imaginations. I suppose I thought it was an awfully jolly thing to have it there, to know my way back to it. But there was the school tugging at me. I expect I was a good deal distraught and inattentive that morning, recalling what I could of the beautiful, strange people I should presently see again. Oddly enough, I had no doubt in my mind that they would be glad to see me. Yes, I must have thought of the garden that morning just as a jolly sort of place to which one might resort in the interludes of a strenuous scholastic career. I didn't go that day at all. The next day was a half-holiday, and that may have weighed with me. Perhaps, too, my state of inattention brought down impositions upon me, and docked the margin of time necessary for the detour. I don't know. What I do know is that in the meantime the enchanted garden was so much upon my mind that I could not keep it to myself. I told, what was his name? A ferrety-looking youngster we used to call Squiff. Young Hopkins, said I. Hopkins it was. I did not like telling him. I had a feeling that in some way it was against the rules to tell him, but I did. He was walking part of the way home with me. He was talkative, and if we had not talked about the enchanted garden, we should have talked of something else, and it was intolerable to me to think about any other subject, so I blabbed. Well, he told my secret. The next day, in the play interval, I found myself surrounded by half a dozen bigger boys, half teasing and wholly curious to hear more of the enchanted garden. There was that big Fawcett, you remember him, and Carnaby, and Morley Reynolds. You weren't there by any chance? No, I think I should have remembered if you were. A boy is a creature of odd feelings. I was, I really believe, in spite of my secret self-disgust, a little flattered to have the attention of these big fellows. I remember particularly a moment of pleasure caused by the praise of Crawshaw. You remember Crawshaw Major, the son of Crawshaw the composer, who said it was the best lie he had ever heard. But at the same time there was a really painful undertow of shame at telling what I felt was indeed a sacred secret. That beast Fawcett made a joke about the girl in green. Wallace's voice sank with the keen memory of that shame. I pretended not to hear, he said. Well, then Carnaby suddenly called me a young liar, and disputed with me when I said the thing was true. I said I knew where to find the green door, could lead them all there in 10 minutes. Carnaby became outrageously virtuous, and said I'd have to, and bear out my words or suffer. Did you ever have Carnaby twist your arm? Then perhaps you'll understand how it went with me. I swore my story was true. There was nobody in the school then to save a chap from Carnaby, though Crawshaw put in a word or so. Carnaby had got his game. I grew excited and red-eared and a little frightened. I behaved altogether like a silly little chap, and the outcome of it all was that instead of starting alone for my enchanted garden, I led the way presently, cheeks flushed, ears hot, eyes smarting, and my soul one burning misery and shame, for a party of 6 mocking, curious, and threatening schoolfellows. We never found the white wall and the green door. You mean? I mean, I couldn't find it. I would have found it if I could. And afterwards, when I could go alone, I couldn't find it. I never found it. I seem now to have been always looking for it through my schoolboy days, but I never came upon it. Never. Did the fellows make it disagreeable? Beastly. Carnaby held a council over me for wanton lying. I remember how I sneaked home and upstairs to hide the marks of my blubbering. But when I cried myself to sleep at last, it wasn't for Carnaby, but for the garden, for the beautiful afternoon I had hoped for the sweet, friendly women, and the waiting playfellows, and the game I had hoped to learn again, that beautiful, forgotten game. I believed firmly that if I had not told, I had bad times after that, crying at night and wool-gathering by day. For 2 terms I slackened and had bad reports. Do you remember? Of course you would. It was you, your beating me in mathematics, that brought me back to the grind again. Part 3. For a time my friend stared silently into the red heart of the fire. Then he said, I never saw it again until I was 17. It leapt upon me for the 3rd time as I was driving to Paddington on my way to Oxford and a scholarship. I had just one momentary glimpse. I was leaning over the apron of my hansom, smoking a cigarette, and no doubt thinking myself no end of a man of the world. And suddenly there was the door, the wall, the dear sense of unforgettable and still attainable things. We clattered by, I too taken by surprise to stop my cab, until we were well past and round a corner. Then I had a queer moment, a double and divergent movement of my will. I tapped the little door in the roof of the cab and brought my arm down to pull out my watch. "Yes, sir?" said the cabman smartly. Well, it's nothing," I cried. "My mistake. We haven't much time. Go on." And he went on. I got my scholarship, and the night after I was told of that, I sat over my fire in my little upper room, my study, in my father's house, with his praise, his rare praise, and his sound counsels ringing in my ears, and I smoked my favourite pipe, the formidable bulldog of adolescence, and thought of that door in the long white wall. If I had stopped, I thought, I should have missed my scholarship. I should have missed Oxford, muddled all the fine career before me. I begin to see things better. I fell musing deeply, but I did not doubt then this career of mine was a thing that merited sacrifice. Those dear friends and that clear atmosphere seemed very sweet to me, very fine but remote. My grip was fixing now upon the world. I saw another door opening, the door of my career. He stared again into the fire. Its red light picked out a stubborn strength in his face for just one flickering moment, and then it vanished again. "Well," he said, and sighed, "I have served that career. I have done much work, much hard work, but I have dreamt of the enchanted garden 1,000 dreams, and seen its door, or at least glimpsed its door, 4 times since then. Yes, 4 times. For a while this world was so bright and interesting, seemed so full of meaning and opportunity, that the half-effaced charm of the garden was, by comparison, gentle and remote. Who wants to pat panthers on the way to dinner with pretty women and distinguished men? I came down to London from Oxford, a man of bold promise that I have done something to redeem. Something, and yet there have been disappointments. Twice I have been in love. I will not dwell on that. But once, as I went to someone who I knew doubted whether I dared to come, I took a short cut at a venture through an unfrequented road near Earl's Court, and so happened on a white wall and a familiar green door. "Odd," said I to myself, "but I thought this place was on Campden Hill. It's the place I never could find somehow, like counting Stonehenge, the place of that queer daydream of mine." And I went by it, intent upon my purpose. It had no appeal to me that afternoon. I had just a moment's impulse to try the door. 3 steps aside were needed at the most, though I was sure enough in my heart that it would open to me. And then I thought that doing so might delay me on the way to that appointment, in which I thought my honour was involved. Afterwards I was sorry for my punctuality. Might at least have peeped in, I thought, and waved a hand to those panthers. But I knew enough by this time not to seek again, belatedly, that which is not found by seeking. Yes, that time made me very sorry. Years of hard work after that, and never a sight of the door. It's only recently that it has come back to me. With it there has come a sense as though some thin tarnish had spread itself over my world. I began to think of it as a sorrowful and bitter thing that I should never see that door again. Perhaps I was suffering a little from overwork. Perhaps it was what I've heard spoken of as the feeling of 40. I don't know. but certainly the keen brightness that makes effort easy has gone out of things recently, and that just at a time, with all these new political developments, when I ought to be working. Odd, isn't it? But I do begin to find life toilsome. Its rewards, as I come near them, cheap. I began a little while ago to want the garden quite badly. Yes, and I've seen it 3 times.
The garden? No, the door. And I haven't gone in.
He leant over the table to me with an enormous sorrow in his voice as he spoke.
Thrice I have had my chance. Thrice! If ever that door offers itself to me again, I swore, I will go in out of this dust and heat, out of this dry glitter of vanity, out of these toilsome futilities. I will go and never return. This time I will stay. I swore it, and when the time came, I didn't go. 3 times in 1 year have I passed that door and failed to enter. 3 times in the last year. The first time was on the night of the snatch division on the Tenants' Redemption Bill, on which the government was saved by a majority of 3. You remember? No one on our side, perhaps very few on the opposite side, expected the end that night. Then the debate collapsed like eggshells. I and Hotchkiss were dining with his cousin at Brentford. We were both unpaired, and we were called up by telephone, and set off at once in his cousin's motor. We got in barely in time, and on the way we passed my wall and door, livid in the moonlight, blotched with hot yellow as the glare of our lamps lit it, but unmistakable. "My God!" cried I. "What?" said Hotchkiss. "Nothing," I answered, and the moment passed. "I've made a great sacrifice," I told the whip as I got in. "They all have," he said, and hurried by. I do not see how I could have done otherwise then, and the next occasion was as I rushed to my father's bedside to bid that stern old man farewell. Then, too, the claims of life were imperative. But the 3rd time was different. It happened a week ago. It fills me with hot remorse to recall it. I was with Gurka and Ralphs. It's no secret now, you know, that I've had my talk with Gurka. We had been dining at Frobisher's, and the talk had become intimate between us. The question of my place in the reconstructed ministry lay always just over the boundary of the discussion. Yes, that's all settled. It needn't be talked about yet, but there's no reason to keep a secret from you. Yes, thanks. But let me tell you my story. Then, on that night, things were very much in the air. My position was a very delicate one. I was keenly anxious to get some definite word from Gurka, but was hampered by Ralph's presence. I was using the best power of my brain to keep that light and careless talk not too obviously directed to the point that concerned me. I had to. Ralph's behaviour since has more than justified my caution. Ralph's, I knew, would leave us beyond the Kensington High Street, and then I could surprise Gurka by a sudden frankness. One has sometimes to resort to these little devices. And then it was that in the margin of my field of vision I became aware once more of the white wall, the green door before us down the road. We passed it, talking. I passed it. I can still see the shadow of Gurka's marked profile, his opera hat tilted forward over his prominent nose, the many folds of his neck-wrap going before my shadow and Ralph's as we sauntered past. I passed within 20 inches of the door. If I say good night to them and go in, I asked myself, what will happen? And I was all a-tingle for that word with Gurka. I could not answer that question in the tangle of my other problems. They will think me mad, I thought. And suppose I vanish now? Amazing disappearance of a prominent politician. That weighed with me. 1,000 inconceivably petty worldlinesses weighed with me in that crisis.
Then he turned on me with a sorrowful smile, and, speaking slowly, "Here I am," he said. "Here I am," he repeated, "and my chance has gone from me. 3 times in 1 year the door has been offered me, the door that goes into peace, into delight, into a beauty beyond dreaming, a kindness no man on earth can know, and I have rejected it, Redmond, and it has gone. How do you know? I know. I know. I am left now to work it out, to stick to the tasks that held me so strongly when my moments came. You say I have success, this vulgar, tawdry, irksome, envied thing. I have it." He had a walnut in his big hand. "If that was my success," he said, and crushed it, and held it out for me to see. "Let me tell you something, Redmond. This loss is destroying me. For 2 months, for 10 weeks nearly now, I have done no work at all, except the most necessary and urgent duties. My soul is full of inappeasable regrets. At nights, when it is less likely I shall be recognized, I go out. I wander. Yes, I wonder what people would think of that if they knew. A cabinet minister, the responsible head of that most vital of all departments, wandering alone, grieving, sometimes near audibly lamenting, for a door, for a garden." Part 4. I can see now his rather pallid face, and the unfamiliar sombre fire that had come into his eyes. I see him very vividly tonight. I sit, recalling his words, his tones, and last evening's Westminster Gazette still lies on my sofa, containing the notice of his death. At lunch today the club was busy with his death. We talked of nothing else. They found his body very early yesterday morning in a deep excavation near East Kensington Station. It is one of 2 shafts that have been made in connection with an extension of the railway southward. It is protected from the intrusion of the public by a hoarding upon the high road, in which a small doorway has been cut for the convenience of some of the workmen who live in that direction. The doorway was left unfastened through a misunderstanding between 2 gangers, and through it he made his way. My mind is darkened with questions and riddles. It would seem he walked all the way from the house that night. He has frequently walked home during the past session, and so it is I figure his dark form coming along the late and empty streets, wrapped up, intent. And then did the pale electric lights near the station cheat the rough planking into a semblance of white? Did that fatal unfastened door awaken some memory? Was there, after all, ever any green door in the wall at all? I do not know. I have told his story as he told it to me. There are times when I believe that Wallace was no more than the victim of the coincidence between a rare but not unprecedented type of hallucination and a careless trap. But that, indeed, is not my profoundest belief. You may think me superstitious, if you will, and foolish, but indeed I am more than half convinced that he had, in truth, an abnormal gift and a sense, something I know not what, that, in the guise of wall and door, offered him an outlet, a secret and peculiar passage of escape into another and altogether more beautiful world. At any rate, you will say, it betrayed him in the end. But did it betray him? There you touch the inmost mystery of these dreamers, these men of vision and the imagination. We see our world fair and common, the hoarding and the pit. By our daylight standard, he walked out of security into darkness, danger, and death. But did he see it like that? End of section 31. Section 32 of The Country of the Blind and Other Stories by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Yearsley. The Country of the Blind. 300 miles and more from Chimborazo, 100 from the snows of Cotopaxi, in the wildest wastes of Ecuador's Andes, there lies that mysterious mountain valley, cut off from the world of men, the country of the blind. Long years ago that valley lay so far open to the world that men might come at last through frightful gorges and over an icy pass into its equable meadows. And thither indeed men came, a family or so of Peruvian half-breeds, fleeing from the lust and tyranny of an evil Spanish ruler. Then came the stupendous outbreak of Mindobamba, when it was night in Quito for 17 days, and the water was boiling at Yaguachi, and all the fish floating, dying, even as far as Guayaquil. Everywhere along the Pacific slopes there were landslips and swift thawings and sudden floods, and one whole side of the old Arauca crest slipped and came down in thunder, and cut off the country of the blind for ever from the exploring feet of men. But one of these early settlers had chanced to be on the hither side of the gorges when the world had so terribly shaken itself, and he perforce had to forget his wife and his child and all the friends and possessions he had left up there, and start life over again in the lower world. He started it again, but blindness overtook him, and he died of punishment in the mines. But the story he told begot a legend that lingers along the length of the Cordilleras of the Andes to this day. He told of his reason for venturing back from that fastness into which he had first been carried, lashed to a llama, beside a vast bale of gear, when he was a child. The valley, he said, had in it all that the heart of man could desire: sweet water, pasture, and even climate, slopes of rich brown soil, with tangles of a shrub that bore an excellent fruit, and on one side great hanging forests of pine that held the avalanches high. Far overhead, on three sides, vast cliffs of grey-green rock were capped by cliffs of ice. But the glacier stream came not to them, but flowed away by the farther slopes, and only now and then huge ice masses fell on the valley side. In this valley it neither rained nor snowed, but the abundant springs gave a rich green pasture, that irrigation would spread all over the valley space. The settlers did well indeed there. Their beasts did well and multiplied, and but one thing marred their happiness, yet it was enough to mar it greatly. A strange disease had come upon them, and had made all the children born to them there, and indeed several older children also, blind. It was to seek some charm or antidote against this plague of blindness that he had, with fatigue and danger and difficulty, returned down the gorge. In those days, in such cases, men did not think of germs and infections, but of sins, and it seemed to him that the reason of this affliction must lie in the negligence of these priestless immigrants to set up a shrine so soon as they entered the valley. He wanted a shrine, a handsome, cheap, effectual shrine, to be erected in the valley. He wanted relics and such like potent things of faith, blessed objects and mysterious medals and prayers. In his wallet he had a bar of native silver, for which he could not account. He insisted there was none in the valley, with something of the insistence of an inexpert liar. They had all clubbed their money and ornaments together, having little need for such treasure up there, he said, to buy them holy help against their ill. I figure this dim-eyed young mountaineer, sunburnt, gaunt, and anxious hat-brim clutched feverishly, a man all unused to the ways of the lower world, telling this story to some keen-eyed, attentive priest before the great convulsion. I can picture him presently seeking to return with pious and infallible remedies against that trouble, and the infinite dismay with which he must have faced the tumbled vastness where the gorge had once come out. But the rest of his story of mischances is lost to me, save that I know of his evil death after several years. Poor stray from that remoteness! The stream that had once made the gorge now bursts from the mouth of a rocky cave, and the legend, his poor ill-told story set going, developed into the legend of a race of blind men somewhere over there, one may still hear today. And amidst the little population of that now isolated and forgotten valley, the disease ran its course. The old became groping and purblind. The young saw but dimly, and the children that were born to them saw never at all. But life was very easy in that snow-rimmed basin, lost to all the world, with neither thorns nor briars, with no evil insects nor any beasts save the gentle breed of llamas they had lugged and thrust and followed up the beds of the shrunken rivers in the gorges up which they had come. The seeing had become purblind so gradually that they had scarcely noted their loss. They guided the sightless youngsters hither and thither until they knew the whole valley marvellously, and when at last sight died out among them, the race lived on. They had even time to adapt themselves to the blind control of fire, which they made carefully in stoves of stone. They were a simple strain of people at the first, unlettered, only slightly touched with the Spanish civilization, but with something of a tradition of the arts of old Peru and of its lost philosophy. Generation followed generation. They forgot many things, they devised many things. Their tradition of the greater world they came from became mythical in colour and uncertain. In all things save sight they were strong and able, and presently the chance of birth and heredity sent one who had an original mind, and who could talk and persuade among them, and then afterwards another. These two passed, leaving their effects, and the little community grew in numbers and in understanding, and met and settled social and economic problems that arose. Generation followed generation. Generation followed generation. There came a time when a child was born who was 15 generations from that ancestor who went out of the valley with a bar of silver to seek God's aid, and who never returned. Thereabouts it chanced that a man came into this community from the outer world, and this is the story of that man. He was a mountaineer from the country near Quito, a man who had been down to the sea and had seen the world, a reader of books in an original way, an acute and enterprising man, and he was taken on by a party of Englishmen who had come out to Ecuador to climb mountains, to replace one of 3 Swiss guides who had fallen ill. He climbed here and he climbed there, and then came the attempt on Parascotopetl, the Matterhorn of the Andes, in which he was lost to the outer world. The story of the accident has been written a dozen times. Pointer's narrative is the best. He tells how the little party worked their difficult and almost vertical way up to the very foot of the last and greatest precipice, and how they built a night shelter amidst the snow upon a little shelf of rock, and, with a touch of real dramatic power, how presently they found Nunez had gone from them. They shouted, and there was no reply, shouted and whistled, and for the rest of that night they slept no more. As the morning broke, they saw the traces of his fall. It seems impossible he could have uttered a sound. He had slipped eastward, towards the unknown side of the mountain. Far below, he had struck a steep slope of snow, and ploughed his way down it in the midst of a snow avalanche. His track went straight to the edge of a frightful precipice, and beyond that everything was hidden. Far, far below, and hazy with distance, they could see trees rising out of a narrow, shut-in valley, the lost country of the blind, but they did not know it was the lost country of the blind, nor distinguish it in any way from any other narrow streak of upland valley. Unnerved by this disaster, They abandoned their attempt in the afternoon, and Pointer was called away to the war before he could make another attack. To this day Parascotopetl lifts an unconquered crest, and Pointer's shelter crumbles unvisited amidst the snows. And the man who fell survived. At the end of the slope he fell 1,000 feet, and came down in the midst of a cloud of snow upon a snow slope even steeper than the one above. Down this he was whirled, stunned and insensible, but without a bone broken in his body, and then at last came to gentler slopes, and at last rolled out and lay still, buried amidst a softening heap of the white masses that had accompanied and saved him. He came to himself with a dim fancy that he was ill in bed, then realized his position with a mountaineer's intelligence, and worked himself loose, and after a rest or so, out until he saw the stars. He rested flat upon his chest for a space, wondering where he was and what had happened to him. He explored his limbs and discovered that several of his buttons were gone, and his coat turned over his head. His knife had gone from his pocket, and his hat was lost, though he had tied it under his chin. He recalled that he had been looking for loose stones to raise his piece of the shelter wall. His ice axe had disappeared. He decided he must have fallen, and looked up to see, exaggerated by the ghastly light of the rising moon, the tremendous flight he had taken. For a while he lay gazing blankly at that vast pale cliff towering above, rising moment by moment out of a subsiding tide of darkness. Its phantasmal, mysterious beauty held him for a space, and then he was seized with a paroxysm of sobbing laughter. After a great interval of time he became aware that he was near the lower edge of the snow. Below, down what was now a moonlit and practicable slope, he saw the dark and broken appearance of rock-strewn turf. He struggled to his feet, aching in every joint and limb, got down painfully from the heaped loose snow about him, went downward until he was on the turf, and there dropped rather than lay beside a boulder, drank deep from the flask in his inner pocket, and instantly fell asleep. He was awakened by the singing of birds in the trees far below. He sat up, and perceived he was on a little alp, at the foot of a vast precipice that was grooved by the gully down which he and his snow had come. Over against him another wall of rock reared itself against the sky. The gorge between these precipices ran east and west, and was full of the morning sunlight, which lit to the westward the mass of fallen mountain that closed the descending gorge. Below him it seemed there was a precipice equally steep, but behind the snow in the gully he found a sort of chimney cleft dripping with snow water, down which a desperate man might venture. He found it easier than it seemed, and came at last to another desolate alp, and then, after a rock climb of no particular difficulty, to a steep slope of trees. He took his bearings and turned his face up the gorge, for he saw it opened out above upon green meadows, among which he now glimpsed quite distinctly a cluster of stone huts of unfamiliar fashion. At times his progress was like clambering along the face of a wall, and after a time the rising sun ceased to strike along the gorge, the voices of the singing birds died away, and the air grew cold and dark about him, but the distant valley with its houses was all the brighter for that. He came presently to talus, and among the rocks he noted, for he was an observant man, an unfamiliar fern that seemed to clutch out of the crevices with intense green hands. He picked a frond or so, and gnawed its stalk, and found it helpful. About midday he came at last out of the throat of the gorge into the plain and the sunlight. He was stiff and weary. He sat down in the shadow of a rock, filled up his flask with water from a spring, and drank it down, and remained for a time resting before he went on to the houses. They were very strange to his eyes, and indeed the whole aspect of that valley became, as he regarded it, queerer and more unfamiliar. The greater part of its surface was lush green meadow, starred with many beautiful flowers, irrigated with extraordinary care, and bearing evidence of systematic cropping piece by piece. High up, and ringing the valley about, was a wall and what appeared to be a circumferential water channel, from which the little trickles of water that fed the meadow plants came, and on the higher slopes above this flocks of llamas cropped the scanty herbage. Sheds, apparently shelters or feeding places for the llamas, stood against the boundary wall here and there. The irrigation streams ran together into a main channel down the centre of the valley, and this was enclosed on either side by a wall breast high. This gave a singularly urban quality to this secluded place, a quality that was greatly enhanced by the fact that a number of paths, paved with black and white stones, and each with a curious little curb at the side, ran hither and thither in an orderly manner. The houses of the central village were quite unlike the casual and higgledy-piggledy agglomeration of the mountain villages he knew. They stood in a continuous row on either side of a central street of astonishing cleanness. Here and there their parti-coloured facade was pierced by a door, and not a solitary window broke their even frontage. They were parti-coloured with extraordinary irregularity, smeared with a sort of plaster that was sometimes grey, sometimes drab, sometimes slate-coloured or dark brown, and it was the sight of this wild plastering first brought the word blind into the thoughts of the explorer. The good man who did that, he thought, must have been as blind as a bat. He descended a steep place, and so came to the wall and channel that ran about the valley, near where the latter spouted out its surplus contents into the deeps of the gorge in a thin and wavering thread of cascade. He could now see a number of men and women resting on piled heaps of grass, as if taking a siesta, in the remoter part of the meadow, and nearer the village a number of recumbent children, and then, nearer at hand, 3 men carrying pails on yokes, along a little path that ran from the encircling wall towards the houses. These latter were clad in garments of llama cloth, and boots and belts of leather, and they wore caps of cloth with back and ear flaps. They followed one another in single file, walking slowly and yawning as they walked, like men who have been up all night. There was something so reassuringly prosperous and respectable in their bearing that, after a moment's hesitation, Nunez stood forward as conspicuously as possible upon his rock, and gave vent to a mighty shout that echoed round the valley. The 3 men stopped, and moved their heads as though they were looking about them. They turned their faces this way and that, and Nunez gesticulated with freedom, but they did not appear to see him, for all his gestures, and after a time, directing themselves towards the mountains far away to the right, they shouted as if in answer. Nunez bawled again, and then once more, and as he gestured ineffectually, the word blind came up to the top of his thoughts. "The fools must be blind," he said. When at last, after much shouting and wrath, Nunez crossed the stream by a little bridge, came through a gate in the wall, and approached them, he was sure that they were blind. He was sure that this was the country of the blind of which the legends told. Conviction had sprung upon him, and a sense of great and rather enviable adventure. The 3 stood side by side, not looking at him, but with their ears directed towards him, judging him by his unfamiliar steps. They stood close together, like men a little afraid, and he could see their eyelids closed and sunken, as though the very balls beneath had shrunk away. There was an expression near awe on their faces. "A man," one said, in hardly recognizable Spanish. "A man it is, a man or a spirit, coming down from the rocks." But Nunez advanced with the confident steps of a youth who enters upon life. All the old stories of the Lost Valley and the country of the blind had come back to his mind, And through his thoughts ran this old proverb, as if it were a refrain. In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And very civilly he gave them greeting. He talked to them and used his eyes. "Where does he come from, Brother Pedro?" asked one. "Down out of the rocks." "Over the mountains I come," said Nunez. "Out of the country beyond there, where men can see, from near Bogota, where there are 100,000 of people, and where the city passes out of sight." "Sight?" muttered Pedro. "Sight?" "He comes," said the second blind man, "out of the rocks." The cloth of their coats, Nunez saw, was curiously fashioned, each with a different sort of stitching. They startled him by a simultaneous movement towards him, each with a hand outstretched. He stepped back from the advance of these spread fingers. "Come hither," said the third blind man, following his motion and clutching him neatly. And they held Nunez and felt him over, saying no word further until they had done so. "Carefully," he cried, with a finger in his eye, and found they thought that organ, with its fluttering lids, a queer thing in him. They went over it again. "A strange creature, Correa," said the one called Pedro. "Feel the coarseness of his hair, like a llama's hair." "Rough he is, as the rocks that begot him," said Correa, investigating Nunez's unshaven chin with a soft and slightly moist hand. "Perhaps he will grow finer." Nunez struggled a little under their examination, but they gripped him firm. "Carefully," he said again. "He speaks," said the third man. "Certainly he is a man." "Ugh," said Pedro, at the roughness of his coat. "And you have come into the world?" asked Pedro. "Out of the world, over mountains and glaciers, right over above there, halfway to the sun, out of the great big world that goes down 12 days' journey to the sea." They scarcely seemed to heed him. "Our fathers have told us men may be made by the forces of nature," said Correa. "It is the warmth of things, and moisture, and rottenness. "Let us lead him to the elders," said Pedro. "Shout first," said Correa, "lest the children be afraid. This is a marvellous occasion." So they shouted, and Pedro went first, and took Nunez by the hand to lead him to the houses. He drew his hand away. "I can see," he said. "See?" said Correa. "Yes, see," said Nunez, turning towards him, and stumbled against Pedro's pail. "His senses are still imperfect," said the third blind man. "He stumbles and talks unmeaning words. Lead him by the hand." "As you will," said Nunez, and was led along, laughing. It seemed they knew nothing of sight. Well, all in good time he would teach them. He heard people shouting, and saw a number of figures gathering together in the middle roadway of the village. He found it tax his nerve and patience more than he had anticipated, that first encounter with the population of the country of the blind. The place seemed larger as he drew near to it, and the smeared plasterings queerer, and a crowd of children and men and women. The women and girls, he was pleased to note, had some of them quite sweet faces, for all that their eyes were shut and sunken, came about him, holding on to him, touching him with soft, sensitive hands, smelling at him, and listening at every word he spoke. Some of the maidens and children, however, kept aloof, as if afraid, and indeed his voice seemed coarse and rude beside their softer notes. They mobbed him. His 3 guides kept close to him with an effect of proprietorship, and said again and again, "A wild man out of the rocks." "Bogota," he said. "Bogota, over the mountain crests." "A wild man, using wild words," said Pedro. "Did you hear that? Bogota. His mind is hardly formed yet. He has only the beginnings of speech." A little boy nipped his hand. "Bogota," he said mockingly. "Aye, a city to your village. I come from the great world where men have eyes and see." "His name's Bogota," they said. "He stumbled," said Correa. "Stumbled twice as we came hither." "Bring him to the elders." and they thrust him suddenly through a doorway into a room as black as pitch, save at the end there faintly glowed a fire. The crowd closed in behind him, and shut out all but the faintest glimmer of day, and before he could arrest himself he had fallen headlong over the feet of a seated man. His arm, outflung, struck the face of someone else as he went down. He felt the soft impact of features, and heard a cry of anger, and for a moment he struggled against a number of hands that clutched him. It was a one-sided fight. An inkling of the situation came to him, and he lay quiet. "I fell down," he said. "I couldn't see in this pitchy darkness." There was a pause, as if the unseen persons about him tried to understand his words. Then the voice of Corea said, "He is but newly formed. He stumbles as he walks, and mingles words that mean nothing with his speech." Others also said things about him that he heard or understood imperfectly. "May I sit up?" he asked in a pause. "I will not struggle against you again." They consulted and let him rise. The voice of an older man began to question him, and Nunez found himself trying to explain the great world out of which he had fallen, and the sky and mountains, and sight and such like marvels, to these elders who sat in darkness in the country of the blind, and they would believe and understand nothing whatever he told them, a thing quite outside his expectation. They would not even understand many of his words. For 14 generations these people had been blind and cut off from all the seeing world. The names for all the things of sight had faded and changed. The story of the outer world was faded and changed to a child's story, and they had ceased to concern themselves with anything beyond the rocky slopes above their circling wall. Blind men of genius had arisen among them, and questioned the shreds of belief and tradition they had brought with them from their seeing days, and had dismissed all these things as idle fancies, and replaced them with new and saner explanations. Much of their imagination had shrivelled with their eyes, and they had made for themselves new imaginations with their ever more sensitive ears and fingertips. Slowly Nunez realized this, that his expectation of wonder and reverence at his origin and his gifts was not to be borne out, and after his poor attempt to explain sight to them had been set aside as the confused version of a new-made being, describing the marvels of his incoherent sensations, he subsided, a little dashed, into listening to their instruction. And the eldest of the blind men explained to him life and philosophy and religion, how that the world, meaning their valley, had been first an empty hollow in the rocks, and then had come first inanimate things without the gift of touch, and llamas, and a few other creatures that had little sense, and then men, and at last angels, whom one could hear singing and making fluttering sounds, but whom no one could touch at all, which puzzled Nunez greatly until he thought of the birds. He went on to tell Nunez how this time had been divided into the warm and the cold, which are the blind equivalents of day and night, and how it was good to sleep in the warm and work during the cold, so that now, but for his advent, the whole town of the blind would have been asleep. He said Nunez must have been specially created to learn and serve the wisdom they had acquired, and that for all his mental incoherency and stumbling behaviour he must have courage, and do his best to learn, and at that all the people in the doorway murmured encouragingly. He said the night, for the blind call their day night, was now far gone, and it behoved everyone to go back to sleep. He asked Nunez if he knew how to sleep, and Nunez said he did, but that before sleep he wanted food. They brought him food, llama's milk, in a bowl, and rough salted bread, and led him into a lonely place to eat out of their hearing, and afterwards to slumber until the chill of the mountain evening roused them to begin their day again. But Nunez slumbered not at all. Instead, he sat up in the place where they had left him, resting his limbs and turning the unanticipated circumstances of his arrival over and over in his mind. Every now and then he laughed, sometimes with amusement and sometimes with indignation. "Unformed mind," he said. "Got no senses yet. They little know they've been insulting their heaven-sent king and master. I see I must bring them to reason. Let me think. Let me think." He was still thinking when the sun set. Nunez had an eye for all beautiful things, and it seemed to him that the glow upon the snowfields and glaciers that rose about the valley on every side was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. His eyes went from that inaccessible glory to the village and irrigated fields fast sinking into the twilight, and suddenly a wave of emotion took him, and he thanked God from the bottom of his heart that the power of sight had been given him. He heard a voice calling to him from out of the village. "Yaho there, Bogota! Come hither!" At that he stood up, smiling. He would show these people once and for all what sight would do for a man. They would seek him, but not find him. "You move not, Bogota," said the voice. He laughed noiselessly, and made 2 stealthy steps aside from the path. "Trample not on the grass, Bogota. That is not allowed." Nunez had scarcely heard the sound he made himself. He stopped, amazed. The owner of the voice came running up the piebald path towards him. He stepped back into the pathway. "Here I am," he said. "Why did you not come when I called you?" said the blind man. "Must you be led like a child? Cannot you hear the path as you walk?" Nunez laughed. "I can see it," he said. "There is no such word as see," said the blind man after a pause. "Cease this folly, and follow the sound of my feet." Nunez followed, a little annoyed. "My time will come," he said. "You'll learn," the blind man answered. "There is much to learn in the world." "Has no one told you, in the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king?" "What is blind?" asked the blind man carelessly over his shoulder. 4 days passed, and the 5th found the king of the blind still incognito as a clumsy and useless stranger among his subjects. It was, he found, much more difficult to proclaim himself than he had supposed, and in the meantime, while he meditated his coup d'etat, he did what he was told, and learnt the manners and customs of the country of the blind. He found working and going about at night a particularly irksome thing, and he decided that that should be the first thing he would change. They led a simple, laborious life, these people, with all the elements of virtue and happiness, as these things can be understood by men. They toiled, but not oppressively. They had food and clothing sufficient for their needs. They had days and seasons of rest. They made much of music and singing, and there was love among them, and little children. It was marvellous with what confidence and precision they went about their ordered world. Everything, you see, had been made to fit their needs. Each of the radiating paths of the valley area had a constant angle to the others, and was distinguished by a special notch upon its curbing. All obstacles and irregularities of path or meadow had long since been cleared away. All their methods and procedure arose naturally from their special needs. Their senses had become marvellously acute. They could hear and judge the slightest gesture of a man a dozen paces away, could hear the very beating of his heart. Intonation had long replaced expression with them, and touches gesture, and their work with hoe and spade and fork was as free and confident as garden work can be. Their sense of smell was extraordinarily fine. They could distinguish individual differences as readily as a dog can, and they went about the tending of the llamas, who lived among the rocks above, and came to the wall for food and shelter, with ease and confidence. It was only when at last Nunez sought to assert himself that he found how easy and confident their movements could be. He rebelled only after he had tried persuasion. He tried at first, on several occasions, to tell them of sight. "Look you here, you people," he said. There are things you do not understand in me." Once or twice, one or two of them attended to him. They sat with faces downcast and ears turned intelligently towards him, and he did his best to tell them what it was to see. Among his hearers was a girl with eyelids less red and sunken than the others, so that one could almost fancy she was hiding eyes, whom especially he hoped to persuade. He spoke of the beauties of sight, of watching the mountains, of the sky and the sunrise, and they heard him with amused incredulity that presently became condemnatory. They told him there were indeed no mountains at all, but that the end of the rocks where the llamas grazed was indeed the end of the world. Thence sprang a cavernous roof of the universe, from which the dew and the avalanches fell. And when he maintained stoutly the world had neither end nor roof, such as they supposed, they said his thoughts were wicked. So far as he could describe sky and clouds and stars to them, it seemed to them a hideous void, a terrible blankness, in the place of the smooth roof to things in which they believed. It was an article of faith with them that the cavern roof was exquisitely smooth to the touch. He saw that in some manner he shocked them, and gave up that aspect of the matter altogether, and tried to show them the practical value of sight. One morning he saw Pedro in the path called 17, and coming towards the central houses, but still too far off for hearing or scent, and he told them as much. "In a little while," he prophesied, "Pedro will be here." An old man remarked that Pedro had no business on path 17, and then, as if in confirmation, that individual, as he drew near, turned and went transversely into path 10, and so back with nimble paces towards the outer wall. They mocked Nunez when Pedro did not arrive, and afterwards, when he asked Pedro questions to clear his character, Pedro denied and outfaced him, and was afterwards hostile to him. Then he induced them to let him go a long way up the sloping meadows towards the wall with one complacent individual, and to him he promised to describe all that happened among the houses. He noted certain goings and comings, but the things that really seemed to signify to these people happened inside of or behind the windowless houses, the only things they took note of to test him by, and of these he could see or tell nothing. And it was after the failure of this attempt, and the ridicule they could not repress, that he resorted to force. He thought of seizing a spade and suddenly smiting one or two of them to earth, and so in fair combat showing the advantage of eyes. He went so far with that resolution as to seize his spade, and then he discovered a new thing about himself, and that was that it was impossible for him to hit a blind man in cold blood. He hesitated, and found them all aware that he had snatched up the spade. They stood alert, with their heads on one side, and bent ears towards him for what he would do next. "Put that spade down," said one, and he felt a sort of helpless horror. He came near obedience. Then he thrust one backwards against a house wall, and fled past him and out of the village. He went athwart one of their meadows, leaving a track of trampled grass behind his feet, and presently sat down by the side of one of their ways. He felt something of the buoyancy that comes to all men in the beginning of a fight, but more perplexity. He began to realize that you cannot even fight happily with creatures who stand upon a different mental basis to yourself. Far away he saw a number of men carrying spades and sticks come out of the street of houses and advance in a spreading line along the several paths towards him. They advanced slowly, speaking frequently to one another, and ever and again the whole cordon would halt and sniff the air and listen. The first time they did this, Nunez laughed, but afterwards he did not laugh. One struck his trail in the meadow grass, and came stooping and feeling his way along it. For 5 minutes he watched the slow extension of the cordon, and then his vague disposition to do something forthwith became frantic. He stood up,
went a pace or so towards the circumferential wall, turned, and went back a little way. There they all stood in a crescent, still and listening. He also stood still, gripping his spade very tightly in both hands. Should he charge them? The pulse in his ears ran into the rhythm of "In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." Should he charge them? He looked back at the high and unclimbable wall behind, unclimbable because of its smooth plastering, but withal pierced with many little doors, and at the approaching line of seekers. Behind these, others were now coming out of the street of houses. Should he charge them? "Bogota!" called one. "Bogota, where are you?" He gripped his spade still tighter and advanced down the meadows towards the place of habitations, and directly he moved they converged upon him. "I'll hit them if they touch me," he swore. "By heaven I will! I'll hit!" He called aloud. "Look here, I'm going to do what I like in this valley. Do you hear? I'm going to do what I like and go where I like." They were moving in upon him quickly, groping yet moving rapidly. It was like playing blind man's buff, with everyone blindfolded except one. "Get hold of him!" cried one. He found himself in the arc of a loose curve of pursuers. He felt suddenly he must be active and resolute. "You don't understand," he cried, in a voice that was meant to be great and resolute, and which broke. "You are blind, and I can see. Leave me alone. Bogota, put down that spade and come off the grass." The last order, grotesque in its urban familiarity, produced a gust of anger. "I'll hurt you," he said, sobbing with emotion. "By heaven, I'll hurt you. Leave me alone." He began to run, not knowing clearly where to run. He ran from the nearest blind man because it was a horror to hit him. He stopped, and then made a dash to escape from their closing ranks. He made for where a gap was wide, and the men on either side, with a quick perception of the approach of his paces, rushed in on one another. He sprang forward, and then saw he must be caught, and swish! The spade had struck. He felt the soft thud of hand and arm, and the man was down with a yell of pain, and he was through, and then he was close to the street of houses again, and blind men whirling spades and stakes were running with a sort of reasoned swiftness hither and thither. He heard steps behind him just in time, and found a tall man rushing forward and swiping at the sound of him. He lost his nerve, hurled his spade a yard wide at his antagonist, and whirled about and fled, fairly yelling as he dodged another. He was panic-stricken. He ran furiously to and fro, dodging when there was no need to dodge, and in his anxiety to see on every side of him at once, stumbling. For a moment he was down, and they heard his fall. Far away, in the circumferential wall, a little doorway looked like heaven, and he set off in a wild rush for it. He did not even look round at his pursuers until it was gained, and he had stumbled across the bridge, clambered a little way among the rocks, to the surprise and dismay of a young llama who went leaping out of sight, and lay down sobbing for breath. And so his coup d'etat came to an end. He stayed outside the wall of the Valley of the Blind for 2 nights and days without food or shelter, and meditated upon the unexpected. During these meditations he repeated very frequently, and always with a profounder note of derision, the exploded proverb, "In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." He thought chiefly of ways of fighting and conquering these people, and it grew clear that for him no practicable way was possible. He had no weapons, and now it would be hard to get one. The canker of civilization had got to him, even in Bogota, and he could not find it in himself to go down and assassinate a blind man. Of course, if he did that, he might then dictate terms on the threat of assassinating them all, but sooner or later he must sleep. He tried also to find food among the pine trees, to be comfortable among pine boughs while the frost fell at night, and, with less confidence, to catch a llama by artifice in order to try to kill it, perhaps by hammering it with a stone, and so finally, perhaps, to eat some of it,
But the llamas had a doubt of him, and regarded him with distrustful brown eyes, and spat when he drew near. Fear came on him the second day, and fits of shivering. Finally he crawled down to the wall of the country of the blind, and tried to make terms. He crawled along by the stream, shouting, until two blind men came out to the gate and talked to him. "I was mad," he said, "but I was only newly made." They said that was better. He told them he was wiser now, and repented of all he had done. Then he wept without intention, for he was very weak and ill now, and they took that as a favourable sign. They asked him if he still thought he could see. "No," he said, "that was folly. The word means nothing, less than nothing." They asked him what was overhead. "About 10 times 10, the height of a man, there is a roof above the world, of rock, and very, very smooth." He burst again into hysterical tears. "Before you ask me any more, give me some food, or I shall die." He expected dire punishments, but these blind people were capable of toleration. They regarded his rebellion as but one more proof of his general idiocy and inferiority, and after they had whipped him, they appointed him to do the simplest and heaviest work they had for anyone to do, and he, seeing no other way of living, did submissively what he was told. He was ill for some days, and they nursed him kindly. That refined his submission, but they insisted on his lying in the dark, and that was a great misery. And blind philosophers came and talked to him of the wicked levity of his mind, and reproved him so impressively for his doubts about the lid of rock that covered their cosmic casserole, that he almost doubted whether indeed he was not the victim of hallucination in not seeing it overhead. So Nunez became a citizen of the country of the blind, and these people ceased to be a generalized people and became individualities and familiar to him, while the world beyond the mountains became more and more remote and unreal. There was Jacob, his master, a kindly man when not annoyed. There was Pedro, Jacob's nephew, and there was Medina Sarote, who was the youngest daughter of Jacob. She was little esteemed in the world of the blind, because she had a clear-cut face and lacked that satisfying glossy smoothness that is the blind man's ideal of feminine beauty. But Nunez thought her beautiful at first, and presently the most beautiful thing in the whole creation. Her closed eyelids were not sunken and red after the common way of the valley, but lay as though they might open again at any moment, and she had long eyelashes, which were considered a grave disfigurement, and her voice was strong, and did not satisfy the acute hearing of the valley swains, so that she had no lover. There came a time when Nunez thought that, could he win her, he would be resigned to live in the valley for all the rest of his days. He watched her, he sought opportunities of doing her little services, and presently he found that she observed him. Once, at a rest-day gathering, they sat side by side in the dim starlight, and the music was sweet. His hand came upon hers, and he dared to clasp it. Then, very tenderly, she returned his pressure, and one day, as they were at their meal in the darkness, he felt her hand very softly seeking him, and, as it chanced, the fire leapt then, and he saw the tenderness of her face. He sought to speak to her. He went to her one day when she was sitting in the summer moonlight, spinning. The light made her a thing of silver and mystery. He sat down at her feet and told her he loved her, and told her how beautiful she seemed to him. He had a lover's voice. He spoke with a tender reverence that came near to awe, and she had never before been touched by adoration. She made him no definite answer, but it was clear his words pleased her. After that he talked to her whenever he could take an opportunity. The valley became the world for him, and the world beyond the mountains, where men lived in sunlight, seemed no more than a fairy tale he would some day pour into her ears. Very tentatively and timidly he spoke to her of sight. Sight seemed to her the most poetical of fancies, and she listened to his description of the stars and the mountains, and her own sweet, white-lit beauty, as though it was a guilty indulgence. She did not believe, she could only half understand, but she was mysteriously delighted, and it seemed to him that she completely understood. His love lost its awe and took courage. Presently he was for demanding her of Jacob and the elders in marriage, but she became fearful and delayed, and it was one of her elder sisters who first told Jacob that Medina Sarote and Nunez were in love. There was from the first very great opposition to the marriage of Nunez and Medina Sarote, not so much because they valued her as because they held him as a being apart, an idiot, incompetent thing below the permissible level of a man. Her sisters opposed it bitterly, as bringing discredit on them all, and old Jacob, though he had formed a sort of liking for his clumsy, obedient serf, shook his head and said the thing could not be. The young men were all angry at the idea of corrupting the race, and one went so far as to revile and strike Nunez. He struck back. Then, for the first time, he found an advantage in seeing even by twilight, and after that fight was over, no one was disposed to raise a hand against him, but they still found his marriage impossible. Old Jacob had a tenderness for his last little daughter, and was grieved to have her weep upon his shoulder. "You see, my dear, he's an idiot. He has delusions. He can't do anything right." "I know," wept Medina Sarote, "but he's better than he was. He's getting better. And he's strong, dear father, and kind, stronger and kinder than any other man in the world. And he loves me, and, father, I love him." Old Jacob was greatly distressed to find her inconsolable, and besides, what made it more distressing, he liked Nunez for many things. So he went and sat in the windowless council chamber with the other elders, and watched the trend of the talk, and said at the proper time, "He's better than he was. Very likely some day we shall find him as sane as ourselves." Then afterwards one of the elders, who thought deeply, had an idea. He was the great doctor among these people, their medicine man, and he had a very philosophical and inventive mind, and the idea of curing Nunez of his peculiarities appealed to him. One day, when Jacob was present, he returned to the topic of Nunez. "I have examined Bogota," he said, "and the case is clearer to me. I think very probably he might be cured." "That is what I have always hoped," said old Jacob. "His brain is affected," said the blind doctor. The elders murmured assent. "Now, what affects it?" "Ah," said old Jacob. "This," said the doctor, answering his own question. "Those queer things that are called the eyes, and which exist to make an agreeable soft depression in the face, are diseased, in the case of Bogota, in such a way as to affect his brain. They are greatly distended. He has eyelashes, and his eyelids move, and consequently his brain is in a state of constant irritation and distraction." "Yes," said old Jacob. "Yes? And I think I may say with reasonable certainty that in order to cure him completely, all that we need do is a simple and easy surgical operation, namely to remove these irritant bodies." "And then he will be sane?" "Then he will be perfectly sane, and a quite admirable citizen." "Thank heaven for science," said old Jacob, and went forth at once to tell Nunez of his happy hopes. But Nunez's manner of receiving the good news struck him as being cold and disappointing. "One might think," he said, "from the tone you take, that you do not care for my daughter." It was Medina Sarote who persuaded Nunez to face the blind surgeons. "You do not want me," he said, "to lose my gift of sight?" She shook her head. "My world is sight." Her head dropped lower. "There are the beautiful things, the beautiful little things, the flowers, the lichens among the rocks. the lightness and softness on a piece of fur, the far sky with its drifting down of clouds, the sunsets and the stars. And there is you. For you alone it is good to have sight, to see your sweet, serene face, your kindly lips, your dear, beautiful hands folded together. It is these eyes of mine you won, these eyes that hold me to you, that these idiots seek. Instead, I must touch you, hear you, and never see you again. I must come under that roof of rock and stone and darkness, that horrible roof under which your imagination stoops. No, you would not have me do that? A disagreeable doubt had arisen in him. He stopped and left the thing a question. "I wish," she said, "sometimes." She paused. "Yes," said he, a little apprehensively. "I wish sometimes you would not talk like that." "Like what?" "I know it's pretty, it's your imagination. I love it, but now—" He felt cold. "Now?" he said faintly. She sat quite still. "You mean you think I should be better? Better, perhaps?" He was realizing things very swiftly. He felt anger indeed, anger at the dull course of fate, but also sympathy for her lack of understanding, a sympathy near akin to pity. "Dear," he said, and he could see by her whiteness how intensely her spirit pressed against the things she could not say. He put his arm about her, he kissed her ear, and they sat for a time in silence. "If I were to consent to this," he said at last, in a voice that was very gentle. She flung her arms about him, weeping wildly. "Oh, if you would," she sobbed. "If only you would." For a week before the operation that was to raise him from his servitude and inferiority to the level of a blind citizen, Nunez knew nothing of sleep, and all through the warm sunlit hours, while the others slumbered happily, he sat brooding or wandering aimlessly, trying to bring his mind to bear on his dilemma. He had given his answer, he had given his consent, and still he was not sure. And at last work time was over, the sun rose in splendour over the golden crests, and his last day of vision began for him. He had a few minutes with Medina Cerote before she went apart to sleep. "Tomorrow," he said, "I shall see no more." "Dear heart," she answered, and pressed his hands with all her strength. "They will hurt you but little," she said, "and you are going through this pain, you are going through it, dear lover, for me. Dear, if a woman's heart and life can do it, I will repay you. My dearest one, my dearest with the tender voice, I will repay." He was drenched in pity for himself and her. He held her in his arms and pressed his lips to hers, and looked on her sweet face for the last time. "Goodbye," he whispered at that dear sight. "Goodbye." And then, in silence, he turned away from her. She could hear his slow retreating footsteps, and something in the rhythm of them threw her into a passion of weeping. He had fully meant to go to a lonely place where the meadows were beautiful with white narcissus, and there remain until the hour of his sacrifice should come. But as he went, he lifted up his eyes and saw the morning like an angel in golden armour marching down the steeps. It seemed to him that before this splendour he and this blind world in the valley, and his love and all, were no more than a pit of sin. He did not turn aside as he had meant to, but went on, and passed through the wall of the circumference, and out upon the rocks, and his eyes were always upon the sunlit ice and snow. He saw their infinite beauty, and his imagination soared over them to the things beyond he was now to resign for ever. He thought of that great free world he was parted from, the world that was his own, and he had a vision of those further slopes, distance beyond distance, with Bogota a place of multitudinous, stirring beauty, a glory by day, a luminous mystery by night, a place of palaces and fountains and statues and white houses lying beautifully in the middle distance. He thought how, for a day or so, one might come down through passes, drawing ever nearer and nearer to its busy streets and ways. He thought of the river journey day by day from great Bogota to the still vaster world beyond, through towns and villages, forest and desert places, the rushing river, day by day, until its banks receded and the big steamers came splashing by, and one had reached the sea, the limitless sea, with its 1,000 islands, its thousands of islands, and its ships seen dimly far away in their incessant journeyings round and about that greater world. And there, unpent by mountains, one saw the sky, not such a disk as one saw it here, but an arch of immeasurable blue, a deep of deeps in which the circling stars were floating. His eyes scrutinized the great curtain of the mountains with a keener inquiry. For example, if one went so up that gully and to that chimney there, then one might come out high among those stunted pines that ran round in a sort of shelf, and rose still higher and higher as it passed above the gorge. And then that talus might be managed. Thence perhaps a climb might be found to take him up to the precipice that came below the snow, and if that chimney failed, then another farther to the east might serve his purpose better, and then one would be out upon the amber-lit snow there, and half-way up to the crest of those beautiful desolations. He glanced back at the village, then turned right round and regarded it steadfastly. He thought of Medina Sarote, and she had become small and remote. He turned again towards the mountain wall, down which the day had come to him. Then, very circumspectly, he began to climb. When sunset came, he was no longer climbing, but he was far and high. He had been higher, but he was still very high. His clothes were torn, his limbs were blood-stained, he was bruised in many places, but he lay as if he were at his ease, and there was a smile on his face. From where he rested, the valley seemed as if it were in a pit, and nearly a mile below. Already it was dim with haze and shadow, though the mountain summits around him were things of light and fire. The mountain summits around him were things of light and fire, and the little details of the rocks near at hand were drenched with subtle beauty, a vein of green mineral piercing the grey, the flash of crystal faces here and there, a minutely beautiful orange lichen close beside his face. There were deep, mysterious shadows in the gorge, blue deepening into purple, and purple into a luminous darkness, and overhead was the illimitable vastness of the sky. But he heeded these things no longer, and lay quite inactive there, smiling as if he were satisfied merely to have escaped from the valley of the blind, in which he had thought to be king. The glow of the sunset passed, and the night came, and still he lay, peacefully contented, under the cold, clear stars. End of section 32. Section 33 of The Country of the Blind and Other Stories by H.G. Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Peter Yearsley. The Beautiful Suit. There was once a little man whose mother made him a beautiful suit of clothes. It was green and gold, and woven so that I cannot describe how delicate and fine it was, and there was a tie of orange fluffiness that tied up under his chin, and the buttons in their newness shone like stars. He was proud and pleased by his suit beyond measure, and stood before the long looking-glass when first he put it on, so astonished and delighted with it that he could hardly turn himself away. He wanted to wear it everywhere and show it to all sorts of people. He thought over all the places he had ever visited, and all the scenes he had ever heard described, and tried to imagine what the feel of it would be if he were to go now to those scenes and places wearing his shining suit, and he wanted to go out forthwith into the long grass and the hot sunshine of the meadow, wearing it, just to wear it. But his mother told him no. She told him he must take great care of his suit, for never would he have another nearly so fine. He must save it, and only wear it on rare and great occasions. It was his wedding suit, she said, and she took the buttons and twisted them up with tissue paper for fear their bright newness should be tarnished, and she tacked little guards over the cuffs and elbows, and wherever the suit was most likely to come to harm. He hated and resisted these things, but what could he do? And at last her warnings and persuasions had effect, and he consented to take off his beautiful suit and fold it into its proper creases and put it away. It was almost as though he gave it up again, but he was always thinking of wearing it, and of the supreme occasions when some day it might be worn without the guards, without the tissue paper on the buttons, utterly and delightfully never caring, beautiful beyond measure. One night, when he was dreaming of it, after his habit, he dreamt he took the tissue paper from one of the buttons, and found its brightness a little faded, and that distressed him mightily in his dream. He polished the poor faded button, and polished it, and if anything it grew duller. He woke up and lay awake, thinking of the brightness a little dulled, and wondering how he would feel if, perhaps, when the great occasion, whatever it might be, should arrive, one button should chance to be ever so little short of its first glittering freshness, and for days and days that thought remained with him distressingly. And when next his mother let him wear his suit, he was tempted, and nearly gave way to the temptation, just to fumble off one little bit of tissue paper and see if indeed the buttons were keeping as bright as ever. He went trimly along on his way to church, full of this wild desire, for you must know his mother did, with repeated and careful warnings, let him wear his suit at times, on Sundays, for example, to and fro from church, when there was no threatening of rain, no dust blowing, nor anything to injure it, with its buttons covered and its protections tacked upon it, and a sunshade in his hand to shadow it if there seemed too strong a sunlight for its colours. And always after such occasions he brushed it over and folded it exquisitely as she had taught him, and put it away again. Now all these restrictions his mother set to the wearing of his suit he obeyed. Always he obeyed them, until one strange night he woke up and saw the moonlight shining outside his window. It seemed to him the moonlight was not common moonlight, nor the night a common night, and for a while he lay quite drowsily with this odd persuasion in his mind. Thought joined on to thought, like things that whisper warmly in the shadows. Then he sat up in his little bed, suddenly very alert, with his heart beating very fast, and a quiver in his body from top to toe. He had made up his mind. He knew that now he was going to wear his suit as it should be worn. He had no doubt in the matter. He was afraid, terribly afraid, but glad, glad. He got out of his bed and stood for a moment by the window, looking at the moonshine-flooded garden, and trembling at the thing he meant to do. The air was full of a minute clamour of crickets and murmurings, of the infinitesimal shoutings of little living things. He went very gently across the creaking boards, for fear that he might wake the sleeping house, to the big dark clothes press wherein his beautiful suit lay folded, and he took it out garment by garment, and softly and very eagerly tore off its tissue paper covering and its tacked protections, until there it was, perfect and delightful, as he had seen it when first his mother had given it to him, a long time, it seemed, ago. Not a button had tarnished, not a thread had faded on this dear suit of his. He was glad enough for weeping, as in a noiseless hurry he put it on, and then back he went, soft and quick, to the window that looked out upon the garden, and stood there for a minute, shining in the moonlight, with his buttons twinkling like stars, before he got out on the sill, and, making as little of a rustling as he could, clambered down to the garden path below. He stood before his mother's house, and it was white, and nearly as plain as by day, with every window blind but his own shut like an eye that sleeps. The trees cast still shadows like intricate black lace upon the wall. The garden in the moonlight was very different from the garden by day. Moonshine was tangled in the hedges, and stretched in phantom cobwebs from spray to spray. Every flower was gleaming white or crimson black, and the air was a-quiver with the thridding of small crickets, and nightingales singing unseen in the depths of the trees. There was no darkness in the world, but only warm, mysterious shadows, and all the leaves and spikes were edged and lined with iridescent jewels of dew. The night was warmer than any night had ever been. The heavens, by some miracle, at once vaster and nearer, and, spite of the great ivory-tinted moon that ruled the world, the sky was full of stars. The little man did not shout nor sing for all his infinite gladness. He stood for a time like one awe-stricken, and then, with a queer small cry, and holding out his arms, he ran out as if he would embrace at once the whole round immensity of the world. He did not follow the neat set paths that cut the garden squarely, but thrust across the beds and through the wet, tall, scented herbs, through the night stock and the nicotine and the clusters of phantom white mallow flowers, and through the thickets of southernwood and lavender, and knee-deep across a wide space of mignonette. He came to the great hedge, and he thrust his way through it, and though the thorns of the brambles scored him deeply, and tore threads from his wonderful suit, and though burrs and goosegrass and havers caught and clung to him, he did not care. He did not care, for he knew it was all part of the wearing for which he had longed. "I am glad I put on my suit," he said. "I'm glad I wore my suit." Beyond the hedge he came to the duck pond, or at least to what was the duck pond by day, but by night it was a great bowl of silver moonshine, all noisy with singing frogs, of wonderful silver moonshine, twisted and clotted with strange patternings, and the little man ran down into its waters, between the thin black rushes, knee-deep and waist-deep, and to his shoulders, smiting the water to black and shining wavelets with either hand, swaying and shivering wavelets, amidst which the stars were netted in the tangled reflections of the brooding trees upon the bank. He waded until he swam, and so he crossed the pond and came out upon the other side, trailing, as it seemed to him, not duckweed, but very silver in long, clinging, dripping masses, and up he went through the transfigured tangles of the willow herb and the uncut seeding grasses of the farther bank. He came, glad and breathless, into the high road. "I am glad," he said, "beyond measure, that I had clothes that fitted this occasion." The high road ran straight as an arrow flies, straight into the deep blue pit of sky beneath the moon, a white and shining road between the singing nightingales, and along it he went, running now and leaping, and now walking and rejoicing, in the clothes his mother had made for him with tireless, loving hands. The road was deep in dust, but that, for him, was only soft whiteness, and as he went, a great dim moth came fluttering round his wet and shimmering and hastening figure. At first he did not heed the moth, and then he waved his hands at it, and made a sort of dance with it as it circled round his head. "Soft moth," he cried, "dear moth, and wonderful night of the world. Do you think my clothes are beautiful, dear moth? As beautiful as your scales, and all this silver vesture of the earth and sky?" And the moth circled closer and closer, until at last its velvet wings just brushed his lips. And next morning they found him dead, with his neck broken, in the bottom of the stone pit, with his beautiful clothes a little bloody, and foul and stained with the duckweed from the pond. But his face was a face of such happiness that, had you seen it, you would have understood indeed how that he had died happy, never knowing that cool and streaming silver for the duckweed in the pond. End of section 33. End of The Country of the Blind and Other Stories by H. G. Wells.